Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth, here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. The snow outside fell in a heavy, unbroken curtain, muffling the world in an eerie stillness. Inside the sprawling Victorian house, Alex moved from room to room, the old wooden floors creaking beneath his every step. The house had stood for over a century, weathering time and storms, yet tonight, it felt more alive than ever. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in ways they shouldn't, and every corner of the house seemed to watch him as he worked. The Christmas tree stood in the center of the living room, its branches heavy with ornaments. Alex hadn't decorated it, it had been like that when he arrived. An old family tradition his mother used to say, the tree decorated itself. A joke, of course. But as Alex examined the ornaments, his stomach knotted. Many of them were unfamiliar, intricate, and old. One in particular caught his eye, a small, tarnished bell, its surface darkened by years of neglect. It hung on a branch near the center of the tree, swaying slightly, though there was no draft in the room. Alex reached out, hesitating as his fingers neared the cold metal. When he finally touched it, a single chilling chime rang out, louder than seemed possible for such a small bell. The room seemed to shift. The fire in the hearth flickered violently before snuffing out completely, leaving the space bathed in shadows. Alex froze, his breath visible in the sudden cold. And then a sound. Faint, almost imperceptible. A voice. Alex? It was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. He spun around, scanning the room, his heart pounding. There was no one there. Just the oppressive silence of the house, broken only by the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. Get a grip, Alex muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. But the unease lingered, crawling up his spine like icy fingers. He busied himself with unpacking boxes, trying to focus on anything but the growing sense of dread. Hours passed. The house settled into a quiet stillness, though the air felt charged as if waiting for something. Alex dozed off on the couch, exhaustion overtaking him. That's when the dream began. He was in a forest, the trees towering above him, their branches clawing at the sky. Snow blanketed the ground, crunching softly under his feet as he moved. The air was heavy, filled with a faint melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Ahead, in a small clearing, stood a Christmas tree. Its ornaments glowed faintly, pulsating like they were alive. And then he saw the figure. It stood at the edge of the clearing, draped in shadows, its face obscured. It raised a hand, pointing toward the tree. "Do you hear it?" the figure whispered, its voice hollow and distant. Alex strained to listen, his breath fogging in the cold air. The melody grew louder, a hauntingly beautiful tune that sent chills down his spine. He woke with a start, his heart racing. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the Christmas tree. He glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. His chest heaved as he tried to shake off the dream, but something caught his eye. The tarnished bell was no longer on the tree. It sat on the nightstand beside him, its surface glinting faintly in the dim light. Alex stared at it, dread creeping over him. He hadn't touched the bell since earlier. How had it moved? The next morning, the house felt colder, quieter. Alex tried to shake off the events of the night, telling himself it was just his imagination. He spent the day unpacking more boxes, sorting through old family belongings. But the house refused to let him feel at ease. By evening, the strange occurrences resumed. Lights flickered, doors creaked, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. Alex tried to ignore it, but the unease grew, gnawing at him. As he sat in the living room that night, staring at the flickering flames in the hearth, he heard it again. The voice. Alex. This time it was louder, clearer. He stood, his heart pounding, and called out, "Who's there?" Silence. And then the bell chimed. He turned to the tree, his breath catching in his throat. The bell swayed on its branch, though the air was still. Slowly he approached, his hands trembling. When he reached for the bell, it chimed again, louder this time, and the room plunged into darkness. The fire went out, and the lights on the tree dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the ornaments. "Alex," the voice came again, closer this time. He turned, his eyes searching the dark, and saw it. A shadow darker than the rest, moving toward him. The voice whispered again, "You shouldn't have come back." Alex staggered backward, his legs hitting the edge of the couch. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he stared into the darkness, searching for the shape that had spoken. The voice was faint now, like a distant echo, but the words lingered in the room like smoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The shadows in the corner of the room seemed thicker, moving in unnatural ways. He fumbled for the flashlight on the coffee table and switched it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. The room appeared empty, but the oppressive feeling remained, weighing heavily on his chest. Forcing himself to breathe, Alex moved cautiously toward the tree. The bell was gone again. This time it wasn't on the tree, the nightstand, or anywhere he could see. His hands trembled as he scanned the room, feeling the weight of something unseen watching him. The sound of creaking wood drew his attention. Slowly, his gaze shifted to the staircase. The sound came again, louder this time, like someone deliberately placing their foot on the old, worn steps. "Hello?" Alex called out, his voice wavering. No response. He stepped closer to the stairs, shining the flashlight up into the darkness. The beam revealed the landing, empty and silent, but the sound of footsteps continued. Each creak echoed louder than the last, coming closer as if something invisible was descending. Alex felt frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that pressed in on him from all sides. Then, from somewhere above, came a sound that made his blood run cold, a faint, childlike giggle. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The giggle came again, echoing down the staircase, followed by a soft whisper that he couldn't quite make out. He took a step back, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and a faint smell of something burning reached his nose. Without warning, the fireplace roared to life behind him, the flames unnaturally high and bright. Alex spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. The fire cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing near the window. "Stop it!" Alex shouted, his voice desperate. The room seemed to shudder, the shadows growing longer and darker. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered wildly, casting strange, distorted patterns. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The fire dimmed to a soft glow, the tree lights stabilized, and the oppressive feeling lifted. Alex collapsed onto the couch, his hands shaking. He didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside made his heart race. By morning, he decided he'd had enough. He couldn't stay in the house another night. He needed answers about the bell, the voices, and the strange events that had been unfolding since his arrival. He searched the attic, digging through old trunks and boxes, hoping to find something that might explain the house's dark history. Most of the belongings were harmless, old clothes, faded photographs, and trinkets from another era. But then he found a small, locked box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The lock was rusted, but with a little effort, Alex pried it open. Inside was a collection of faded documents and an old journal bound in cracked leather. The journal's pages were filled with spidery handwriting, and as Alex read, the pieces began to fall into place. The house, it seemed, had a history darker than he'd ever imagined. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Carter, who had lived there over a century ago. Elias wrote of strange happenings during Christmas, unexplained noises, mysterious figures, and a sense of being watched. He believed the house was cursed, its curse tied to an object he called the Bell of Morning. Alex's heart sank as he read Elias's words. The bell is a conduit, a bridge between worlds. It calls to them those who are trapped, those who seek vengeance. Once it rings, they will come, and they will not leave until they have taken what they desire. The journal detailed Elias's attempts to rid himself of the bell, but no matter where he sent it, it always found its way back. Eventually, the entry stopped abruptly, leaving Alex with more questions than answers. He stared at the journal, his mind racing. If the bell was truly cursed, how had it ended up on his family's Christmas tree? And more importantly, what did it want now? The sound of the front door creaking open pulled Alex from his thoughts. He froze, listening. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the hallway below. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He grabbed the flashlight and cautiously made his way downstairs. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the cold wind. Alex stepped outside, scanning the snowy yard. Everything was still, the snow undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading from the door to the woods beyond. The footprints were small, like those of a child. Alex hesitated, the cold biting at his skin, but something compelled him to follow. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, stepping into the snow. The prints led deeper into the woods, winding through the trees. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint melody from his dream returned, drifting through the stillness. As he reached a small clearing, Alex's breath caught. There, in the center, stood a Christmas tree just like the one in his dream. Its ornaments shimmered in the pale moonlight, and at its base lay the bell, glinting in the snow. Before he could move, the giggle came again, closer this time. Alex spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. Then a voice whispered from behind him, "You can't escape it, Alex. Not anymore." Alex turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The voice that whispered his name had come from mere feet away, yet the clearing appeared empty. The bell lay in the snow, its tarnished surface gleaming faintly under the moonlight. He took a cautious step back, his breath visible in the freezing air, every instinct screaming at him to leave. The forest around him was deathly quiet. No rustling branches, no chirping crickets, just an unnatural silence that pressed down on him like a weight. The faint melody that had led him here began to grow louder, more distinct. It wasn't beautiful now, it was haunting, discordant, like a lullaby twisted into something malevolent. Alex's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The journal's warnings echoed in his thoughts. The bell is a conduit, a bridge between worlds. He stared at it in the snow, his stomach churning with dread. If this was the same bell Elias Carter had written about, then the whispers, the shadows, and the inexplicable events were just the beginning. And then the giggle came again. This time it wasn't distant. It was behind him. Alex whipped around, shining his flashlight into the trees. For a split second, he saw movement, a small figure darting between the trunks, too quick for him to make out any details. The giggle echoed again, this time from his left. He spun toward the sound, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The only response was the wind, which had picked up suddenly, carrying with it a biting chill that made his teeth chatter. But there was something else on the wind, words, faint and fragmented, like a distant chant. "Asterisk, bring it back. Bring it back, asterisk." Alex staggered backward, the weight of the words pressing into his mind. He glanced at the bell again, now sitting upright in the snow as though it had been placed there deliberately. Bring it back where? Suddenly the melody stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, without warning, the bell rang. The sound wasn't loud, but it vibrated through Alex's chest, freezing him in place. He could feel it reverberate through the ground, through the air, as though the forest itself had acknowledged the bell's chime. The temperature plummeted. Frost began to creep along the nearby trees, their branches cracking under the weight of ice. Alex's breath came in quick, shallow bursts as his flashlight began to flicker. And then he saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was small, the size of a child, but its features were obscured by the darkness. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were being pulled along by invisible strings. Alex's grip on the flashlight tightened as the figure stepped closer, its face still hidden. "Stay back," he shouted, but the words sounded hollow in the oppressive stillness. The figure paused, tilting its head as if studying him. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed toward the bell. Alex's blood ran cold. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took another step forward, and as it did, its face came into view. It was a child, no older than 8, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its mouth curled into a smile that didn't reach its eyes. "Bring it back," the child said, its voice layered with something ancient and inhuman. Alex took another step back, nearly tripping over a root. "I don't understand. Bring what back?" The child pointed at the bell again, its smile widening unnaturally. "Return it, or they will come," it said, its voice echoing strangely as though a dozen others spoke alongside it. Before Alex could respond, the child vanished, dissolving into a swirl of shadows that disappeared into the trees. The silence returned, but it was different now, heavier, more oppressive. Alex stared at the bell, his mind racing. If he left it here, would it stop? Would the voices, the shadows, the unnatural cold all go away? Or would it follow him just as it had followed Elias Carter? The thought of touching the bell made his skin crawl, but he couldn't leave it behind. Not without understanding what it was or why it had been left on his family's Christmas tree. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Alex knelt down and reached for the bell. The moment his fingers closed around it, the forest erupted into chaos. The wind howled, tearing through the clearing with a force that nearly knocked him over. The trees groaned and swayed, their branches clawing at the sky. And then came the whispers, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with anger and desperation. Alex stumbled to his feet, clutching the bell tightly. He had to get out of there. He turned and ran, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he fled the clearing. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more insistent. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, and the giggle echoed through the trees, mocking him. By the time he reached the house, he was out of breath, his chest burning. He slammed the door shut behind him and leaned against it, trying to calm his racing heart. The house was eerily quiet. The warmth of the fire and the twinkling lights on the Christmas tree seemed almost comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. But Alex knew better than to feel safe. He placed the bell on the coffee table, staring at it as though it might spring to life. The journal's words echoed in his mind. Once it rings, they will come. Alex didn't sleep that night. He stayed by the fire, watching the bell, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the house remained still, as though holding its breath. As dawn broke, Alex made a decision. He couldn't stay here. He needed to find someone who could help, someone who might know what the bell was and how to get rid of it. But as he packed his bag, the voices returned, louder than ever. "You can't leave," they whispered, their tone almost mocking. The bell chimed once, twice, and then went silent. Alex froze mid-step, his bag slipping from his grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. The bell sat silently on the coffee table, its tarnished surface glinting faintly in the dim light. The house felt alive now, its very walls pulsing with the echoes of the whispers that had filled the air moments before. "You can't leave." The words circled his mind, repeating over and over like a mantra he couldn't shake. His instincts screamed at him to get out, to run and never look back, but deep down he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The bell was a tether. He moved toward the coffee table, his fingers trembling as he reached for the bell. The moment his hand touched it, a jolt shot through his body, a cold, searing pain that left him gasping. He pulled his hand back, staring at the bell as though it had bitten him. And then, from somewhere upstairs, came the sound of a door creaking open. Alex's head snapped toward the staircase. He hadn't been upstairs since he arrived, too unnerved by the thought of venturing into the dark, empty rooms that had once been his family's. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was opening every door one by one. He grabbed the flashlight from the table, its weight comforting in his hand, and started toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air around him thick and oppressive. By the time he reached the landing, his breath came in short, shallow gasps. The hallway stretched before him, each door slightly ajar. The house was silent again, but Alex could feel something watching him, waiting. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer. He shone the flashlight into the first room, a guest bedroom untouched since his parents' time. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and a thin layer of dust coated the furniture. Nothing out of place. The next room was the same, and the next. Each one was eerily pristine, as though frozen in time. But when he reached the door at the end of the hallway, the one that had always been locked when he was a child, his stomach twisted into knots. It was open now. Alex hesitated, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. This room had always been off-limits, a mystery that his parents refused to explain. He had peeked through the keyhole once as a child, but all he had seen was darkness. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the air. The flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing a small bed pushed against the wall, a wooden rocking chair in the corner, and an old chest at the foot of the bed. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, the pattern barely visible beneath years of grime. And then he saw it. Carved into the floorboards, directly in the center of the room, was a circle filled with strange symbols. They were jagged and crude, etched deep into the wood, and their edges were darkened as though burned. Alex stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The symbols seemed to writhe and twist under the flashlight beam, and he had to blink several times to convince himself it was just his imagination. He crouched down, running his fingers over the carvings. The wood was cold to the touch, almost icy, and as his fingers traced the lines, a sharp pain shot through his hand. He pulled back, staring at his palm. A small cut had appeared, blood welling up and dripping onto the floor. The room seemed to shift around him. The air grew heavier, the shadows darker, and a low, guttural sound filled the space. It wasn't a growl exactly, but a deep, resonant vibration that made his bones ache. Alex scrambled to his feet, backing away from the circle. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and the rocking chair in the corner began to move. Back and forth, back and forth. "Who's there?" Alex shouted, his voice breaking. The chair stopped abruptly, the silence that followed even more deafening. And then, from the shadows near the bed, a voice whispered, "Bring it here." Alex's flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as though struggling against the darkness. The shadows in the corner shifted, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a face, a pale, hollow-eyed figure staring back at him. "No," Alex said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what you want, but I'm not doing this." The voice came again, louder this time, layered with the same inhuman tones he had heard in the woods. "Bring it here or they will take you." The floorboards beneath Alex's feet began to vibrate, the symbols in the circle glowing faintly. The walls seemed to close in around him, and a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the flashlight's beam. In the darkness, Alex could feel them, figures moving, circling him, their presence cold and suffocating. He stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the door frame as he tried to escape the room. The moment he crossed the threshold, the oppressive feeling lifted. The hallway was silent and still, as though nothing had happened. But Alex knew better. He ran downstairs, his heart hammering in his chest. The bell was still on the coffee table, sitting innocently amidst the chaos that had become his life. He grabbed it without thinking, the cold metal biting into his skin, and ran out of the house. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the car. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away. As he drove down the winding road that led away from the house, the whispers began again, faint but persistent. "You can't run, Alex." He glanced at the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. In the back seat, just for a moment, he saw the child, the same hollow-eyed figure from the woods, smiling that unnatural smile. The car swerved as Alex nearly lost control, the image vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, and focused on the road ahead. But no matter how far he drove, the whispers stayed with him, growing louder with each passing mile. "You can't escape." The endless stretch of snow-covered road seemed to close in on Alex, the dark trees on either side looming like silent sentinels. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached. The whispers in the back of his mind had grown louder, sharper, like nails scraping against glass. "You can't escape." The words weren't just in his head anymore, they filled the car, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the hollow-eyed child staring back at him, but the back seat was empty. For now. Alex pressed harder on the gas pedal, the car skidding slightly on the icy road. The bell sat in the passenger seat, its tarnished surface seeming to pulse faintly with an otherworldly glow. Every instinct told him to throw it out the window, to leave it behind and never look back. But he couldn't. Something deep inside whispered that it wouldn't matter. The bell had chosen him, or maybe it had always been with him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The road curved sharply, and Alex's heart lurched as the tires struggled to find grip on the ice. The car fishtailed, and for a terrifying moment he thought he would skid off the road and into the dark forest. But the tires caught, and he managed to steer the car back onto the path. He didn't see the figure standing in the middle of the road until it was too late. The headlights illuminated a pale, gaunt face, hollow eyes staring directly at him. Alex slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt mere inches from the figure. But when he looked up, the road was empty. His breathing was ragged, his chest tight as he scanned the area. Snow fell softly around him, the flakes swirling in the car's headlights. There was no one there. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life, a burst of static that made Alex jump. He hadn't even realized the radio was on. The static faded, replaced by a faint, haunting melody, familiar yet distorted as though played on an old, warped record. The same melody that had lured him into the woods. Alex reached for the volume knob, but before he could turn it down, a voice came through the speakers. "Alex?" It was his mother's voice. He froze, his hand hovering over the knob. His mother had died when he was a teenager, yet the voice was unmistakable, soft, soothing, and filled with a warmth he hadn't heard in years. "Alex," the voice said again, gentle but insistent. "Why won't you come home?" Tears welled in his eyes as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "You're not real," he whispered, his voice trembling. The voice laughed softly, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "Oh, but I am. I've always been with you, Alex. You've just forgotten." The static returned, louder this time, and the melody warped into something darker, more menacing. The headlights flickered, plunging the road into brief darkness before coming back on. And that's when he saw them. Figures lined the road on either side, their forms barely visible in the falling snow. They stood motionless, their faces obscured by shadow, but Alex could feel their hollow eyes boring into him. The radio crackled again, the static rising to a deafening pitch. Alex covered his ears, his head pounding as the whispers returned, overlapping and blending into a cacophony of sound. "Bring it back. Bring it back. Bring it back." The bell in the passenger seat began to vibrate, its faint glow intensifying. Alex stared at it, his mind racing. What did they want? Where was he supposed to take it? The answer came in a sudden flash of memory, his grandfather's voice, telling him stories of the old church on the outskirts of town. A place abandoned long before Alex was born, said to be cursed by something too dark to name. "Take it back to where it began," the voice on the radio said, no longer his mother's but something ancient and guttural. Alex slammed the car into gear and sped down the road, the figures on either side turning their heads to watch him as he passed. The whispers grew louder, filling the car until he thought his head might explode. The old church came into view, its crumbling steeple barely visible through the falling snow. The building was a relic of another time, its wooden walls warped and weathered, the windows shattered and dark. Alex parked the car haphazardly and grabbed the bell, its surface icy cold against his palm. He stepped out into the snow, the whispers now a dull roar in his ears. The church door creaked open as he approached, as though inviting him inside. The interior was worse than he had imagined. The pews were broken, the altar covered in a thick layer of dust. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, similar to the ones he had seen in the upstairs room of his family's house. The air was suffocating, heavy with a sense of dread. Alex moved toward the altar, the bell growing colder with each step. As he placed the bell on the altar, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that pressed down on him with an almost physical force. And then the shadows came alive. Figures emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They surrounded Alex, their movements jerky and unnatural. He tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. One of the figures stepped forward, its face a grotesque mask of decay and malice. It reached out, its skeletal fingers brushing against the bell. "You've done well," it said, its voice a rasping whisper. Before Alex could respond, the bell rang. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, deep, resonant, and filled with an ancient power that made his skin crawl. The figures began to dissolve into shadows, their forms swirling around the bell like a vortex. The last thing Alex saw before everything went black was the bell, glowing brightly as it absorbed the shadows. When he woke up, he was lying in the snow outside the church, the bell nowhere to be seen. The whispers were gone, the forest silent once more. But deep down, Alex knew it wasn't over. Alex lay in the snow for what felt like hours, his body trembling as the cold seeped into his bones. The silence around him was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through the barren trees. The bell was gone, but its presence lingered like an invisible weight pressing on his chest. When he finally managed to sit up, his head spun, and a wave of nausea rolled over him. The church loomed behind him, its warped wooden frame casting long shadows in the dim light of the early morning. He couldn't bring himself to look at it for long. There was something wrong about the way it stood, as though it were watching him, waiting for him to step inside again. Staggering to his feet, Alex brushed the snow off his clothes and started back toward the car. His footsteps crunched loudly in the stillness, each step echoing like a gunshot in the eerie quiet. The car sat where he had left it, covered in a thin layer of frost. Alex yanked the door open and slid into the driver's seat, his fingers trembling as he fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered to life, and for a brief moment, the sound of the motor was enough to steady his nerves. But as he pulled onto the road, the unease crept back in. The whispers were gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left him. He glanced in the rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see something lurking in the back seat. Each time, the space behind him was empty, but the tension in his chest refused to ease. The drive back to town felt endless, the snow-covered landscape blurring together as exhaustion began to take its toll. When the small, flickering lights of the gas station on the edge of town came into view, Alex felt a wave of relief wash over him. He pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine, letting the silence settle around him. The fluorescent lights inside the station cast a pale, unnatural glow over the rows of empty shelves. Alex hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. Inside, the station was empty. The clerk's chair behind the counter was vacant, and the faint smell of gasoline hung in the air. "Hello?" Alex called out, his voice echoing in the small space. No response. He moved toward the counter, his boots squeaking against the tile floor. A small television mounted on the wall behind the counter was playing the local news, the volume turned low. Alex caught snippets of the broadcast as he approached. Unexplained power outages, authorities investigating, local residents reporting strange sightings. He stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. The screen flickered, the image distorting for a moment before returning to normal. "Is anyone here?" he called again, louder this time. The sound of shattering glass made him spin around, his pulse racing. One of the windows at the front of the station had cracked, a thin fracture snaking across the surface like a spiderweb. And then he saw it. A figure stood just outside the window, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its features obscured by the shadows. Alex's breath caught in his throat as the figure tilted its head, as though studying him. "Hey," he shouted, his voice shaking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. Alex backed away, his eyes darting to the exit. He didn't know what this thing was, but every instinct screamed at him to get out. The lights in the station flickered, casting the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, the figure was gone. Alex didn't waste another second. He bolted for the door, his boots skidding on the tile as he ran back to the car. The engine roared to life, and he sped out of the parking lot, his hands gripping the wheels so tightly they ached. The town was quiet as he drove through the empty streets. Most of the houses were dark, their windows black and lifeless. It wasn't until he reached the outskirts of town that he realized something was wrong. The road ahead was blocked. A line of cars sat abandoned across the road, their doors hanging open. The snow around them was undisturbed, as though they had been left there recently. Alex slowed the car to a crawl, his breath fogging the windshield as he scanned the scene. Something about the cars felt off. Their windows were fogged over, and the interiors were dark, but he could feel eyes on him, watching from the shadows. The radio crackled to life again, static filling the car. Alex's stomach twisted as the same haunting melody from before drifted through the speakers. "No," he muttered, reaching for the volume knob. The static cut off abruptly, replaced by a voice, low and guttural like the growl of a beast. "You can't run." The words sent a chill down Alex's spine, and he slammed his foot on the gas. The car swerved around the abandoned vehicles, narrowly avoiding the ditch as he sped down the road. The voice followed him, echoing in his mind. "You brought it back, but you are not free." Alex didn't know where he was going anymore. The snow fell heavier now, obscuring the road ahead. The headlights struggled to cut through the swirling white, and the car's tires skidded on the icy surface. He felt trapped, as though the forest around him had come alive, its twisted branches reaching out to pull him back. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a small cabin, its windows glowing faintly with warm light. Alex's heart leaped. He didn't know who lived there, but it was his only chance. He pulled the car to a stop outside the cabin, the tires crunching over the snow, and stumbled out. The wind howled around him as he made his way to the door, his fingers numb as he knocked. For a moment there was no response. Then the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man standing in the doorway. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp and knowing. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the man said, his voice grave. Alex opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Come inside," the man said, stepping aside. "You don't want to be out here when they come." The warmth of the cabin hit Alex like a physical force, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it felt like safety. The fire crackled in the corner, its flames casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The faint scent of pine and something earthy lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The old man shut the door firmly behind Alex and bolted it with a series of heavy locks. The sound of metal sliding into place sent a shiver through Alex's body, as though the man was sealing them off from something far worse than the icy storm. "Sit," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Alex hesitated, his legs trembling beneath him. The weight of everything, the bell, the whispers, the figures in the forest, pressed down on him like a suffocating fog. He sank into a worn wooden chair near the fire, the heat thawing the numbness in his fingers and toes. The old man moved with an unsettling efficiency, his gnarled hands gathering mugs and a pot of steaming liquid from a small stove. He placed a cup in front of Alex, the dark liquid inside giving off a bitter aroma. "Drink," the man said, his sharp eyes fixed on Alex. "You'll need it." Alex wrapped his hands around the mug, the warmth seeping into his skin. He hesitated for a moment before taking a cautious sip. The liquid burned his throat, but it filled him with a strange sense of clarity, as though a fog had lifted from his mind. The man sat across from him, his gaze piercing and unrelenting. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each line etched with a story Alex wasn't sure he wanted to hear. "You've brought it back, haven't you?" the man said finally, his voice heavy with something Alex couldn't quite place. Fear, resignation, maybe both. Alex set the mug down, his hands trembling. "The bell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I left it at the church. It's gone now." The man's eyes narrowed and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Gone? You think it's gone just because you left it there?" He let out a bitter laugh that sent chills down Alex's spine. "It's never gone. Not until it decides to leave you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alex stared into the fire, his mind racing. "What is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What does it want?" The old man leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "It's older than you can imagine," he said, his voice quiet. "Older than this town, older than the church, older than any of us. They say it was forged in a time when the lines between this world and others were thinner. It's not just a bell. It's a bridge. A beacon." Alex's stomach twisted. "A beacon for what?" The man's gaze snapped back to him, and for the first time, Alex saw real fear in his eyes. For them? The cabin seemed to grow colder, the fire's warmth no longer enough to chase away the chill. Alex's mind flashed to the figures in the woods, their hollow eyes watching him from the darkness. "You've seen them," the man said as though reading his thoughts. "The shadows. The hollow ones. They come for the bell, yes, but they also come for the one who carries it." Alex's breath caught in his throat. "But I left it behind," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "It's not with me anymore." The man shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. The bell doesn't need to be in your hand to claim you. The moment you touched it, the moment you heard its call, it marked you. You're bound to it now, whether you like it or not." Alex felt his chest tighten, his heart pounding like a drum. "How do I stop it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The man's expression darkened. "You don't. Not completely. But there might be a way to hold it off, to send it back where it came from. It's dangerous, though, and it doesn't always work." Alex leaned forward, desperation clawing at him. "Tell me." The old man hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of his mug. "There's a place deep in the woods," he said finally. "A clearing where the veil between worlds is thinnest. They say it's where the bell was first forged, where its power is strongest. If you can make it there and perform the rite, you might be able to sever its connection to you." Alex's mind raced, the weight of the man's words sinking in. "What kind of rite?" The man's gaze hardened. "A sacrifice," he said simply. Alex's stomach churned. "What kind of sacrifice?" The old man's silence was answer enough. Before Alex could press him further, the wind outside picked up, a low, mournful howl that rattled the windows. The fire flickered, its flames dancing wildly as the temperature in the cabin plummeted. "They're here," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alex turned toward the window, his breath catching in his throat. Shadows moved outside, their forms barely visible in the swirling snow. They circled the cabin like predators, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The old man rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He grabbed a long rusted shotgun from the wall and checked the chamber. "They won't wait long," he said, his voice grim. Alex stood, his legs trembling. "What do we do?" The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You run," he said. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." Alex opened his mouth to argue, but the man cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You don't have time to argue. Take the back door. Head for the clearing. And whatever you do, don't stop." Before Alex could process what was happening, the man shoved a map into his hands and pushed him toward the back of the cabin. The sound of glass shattering filled the air, followed by the guttural growls of the figures outside. "Go!" the man shouted, raising the shotgun as the front door burst open. Alex didn't look back. He bolted through the back door and into the freezing night, the map clutched tightly in his hand. The wind howled around him, the snow blinding as he stumbled through the forest. Behind him, the sounds of the struggle faded, replaced by the whispers he thought he had left behind. They were coming for him. The forest swallowed Alex whole, its skeletal trees rising like sentinels in the frozen dark. Each step felt heavier than the last, his boots crunching through the snow as the icy wind clawed at his face. The whispers were no longer distant. They wrapped around him, circling like vultures, their tones shifting between curiosity and malice. He clutched the map in his trembling hands, the paper crackling as he tried to read it by the faint beam of his flashlight. The ink was smudged, the lines barely legible, but one thing was clear: the clearing was still miles away. The wind carried faint echoes of the chaos he'd left behind. Gunshots, each one a sharp, jarring crack, pierced the night, followed by guttural growls and inhuman shrieks. He could almost picture the old man standing in the doorway, his shotgun raised as those hollow-eyed figures closed in. But now, silence. Alex's chest tightened. He didn't want to think about what that silence meant. He forced himself to focus on the map, tracing the faint line that led deeper into the woods. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, each one visible in the freezing air. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. And then the whispers changed. They grew louder, more insistent, each voice overlapping the next in a chaotic symphony. Alex's flashlight flickered, the beam faltering as the cold seemed to seep into its batteries. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, darting between the trees, too quick to focus on. "Keep going," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "Don't stop." But the forest didn't let him go so easily. A low growl rumbled from somewhere behind him, deep and guttural, like a predator stalking its prey. Alex froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly he turned, his flashlight shaking as he aimed it toward the sound. The beam caught movement, something tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it slipped between the trees. "Leave me alone," Alex shouted, his voice cracking. The growl grew louder, joined by others, until the forest seemed alive with the sound. Alex turned and ran, the map crumpled in his fist. The snow was deeper here, each step a struggle as his legs burned with effort. The growls followed him, closing in. His foot caught on a root and he went down hard, the impact jarring his bones. The flashlight flew from his hand, landing several feet away. Its beam illuminated the forest floor, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. Alex scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting to the flashlight. But before he could reach it, a figure stepped into the light. It was one of them. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, its face a grotesque mockery of humanity. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and its long, spindly arms reached out toward him. Alex backed away, his breath hitching as his hands searched the ground for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a rock, and he hurled it at the creature with all his strength. The rock struck its shoulder, and the creature let out an ear-splitting screech that made Alex's ears ring. But it didn't stop. It lunged at him, its movements unnaturally fast. Alex turned and ran, his lungs burning as the whispers closed in around him. The trees seemed to shift, their branches reaching out to block his path. He didn't know how long he ran, only that his legs felt like lead and his vision blurred with exhaustion. The growls faded, replaced by the sound of rushing water. Alex stumbled into a clearing, the trees giving way to a frozen river that glittered in the moonlight. He dropped to his knees, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The clearing. It had to be the clearing. He pulled out the map, his hands shaking too much to hold it steady. His eyes scanned the page, searching for some kind of confirmation. But before he could find it, a low melodic hum filled the air. The bell. Its sound was different now, deeper, more resonant, as though it were calling out to something far older and far more dangerous. The ice on the river cracked, a jagged line splitting the surface. Alex scrambled back, his heart pounding as the cracks spread, radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. And then from beneath the ice they came. Figures rose from the frozen depths, their bodies skeletal and wrapped in tattered, frost-covered shrouds. Their hollow eyes glowed with a pale, eerie light, and their mouths moved in silent whispers that filled Alex's mind. He stumbled to his feet, the map slipping from his fingers. The figures moved toward him, their steps slow and deliberate as though savoring the chase. Alex's mind raced. He didn't know the right. He didn't know what to do. The old man's words echoed in his head, a sacrifice. But what could he offer that would satisfy them? The bell's hum grew louder, resonating through the clearing and shaking the very ground beneath him. The figures stopped, their heads turning toward the sound. Alex's eyes darted around the clearing, searching for anything that could help him. His gaze fell on the jagged cracks in the ice, the dark water churning below. An idea formed in his mind, reckless and desperate. He moved toward the river, his heart pounding as the figures followed. Their hollow eyes fixed on him, their movements growing faster, more frenzied. Alex reached the edge of the ice and stopped, his breath coming in short gasps. He turned to face the figures, his hands trembling as he shouted over the sound of the bell. "Is this what you want?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Take it then." Before he could second-guess himself, Alex stepped onto the ice. The surface groaned beneath his weight, the cracks spreading with each step. The figures followed, their hollow eyes locked onto him as they moved onto the fragile surface. The ice gave way. Alex felt the world tilt as he plunged into the freezing water, the cold biting into his skin like 1,000 needles. The figures followed, their skeletal forms disappearing into the dark depths. The bell's hum reached a deafening crescendo, and then, silence. Alex's vision blurred, the cold sapping the strength from his body. He fought to stay above the water, his limbs growing heavier with each passing second. And then, as his consciousness began to fade, he felt something grab his arm. A hand, warm and strong, pulled him from the icy depths. Alex's chest burned as he gasped for air, his lungs filling with oxygen in a rush that almost made him dizzy. He had no idea how long he'd been in the freezing water, but the cold seemed to seep into every bone, every muscle, making it feel like he was being held in place by invisible chains. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and his entire body trembled from shock. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, that he'd slipped into some sort of hallucination. How else could he explain the warmth flooding through his arm? The hand that had pulled him from the depths was still gripping him, strong and steady, but not like a person's hand. The fingers were too long, too cold, and there was something unnerving about the way it didn't release him. Alex tried to look up, but his vision swam, his thoughts sluggish and fragmented. Through the blur, he saw a figure standing above him, half obscured by mist, their features hidden. What are you?" he croaked, the words barely escaping his lips. The figure didn't answer, but the grip on his arm tightened, dragging him out of the water and onto solid ground. Once Alex's feet hit the cold earth, the figure released him and he collapsed onto the wet ground, shivering uncontrollably. His head spun, but through the fog of exhaustion, he could make out the faintest outline of the figure. It was tall, humanoid but unsettling, and its face was covered with a dark, tattered hood that seemed to blend into the mist. For a moment, everything was still. Then the figure knelt beside him, and Alex could feel the weight of its gaze even if he couldn't see its eyes. The air felt thick with an unsettling energy, like the forest itself had paused, holding its breath. I didn't mean to," Alex whispered, his words barely more than a desperate murmur. "I didn't mean to bring it back. I didn't mean to." The figure's hand came down gently on his forehead, and Alex's heart skipped a beat. The touch was colder than anything he had ever felt, and for a moment he thought it might burn through him entirely. But instead it felt grounding. A low voice, not quite human, emanated from the figure. "Asterisk, you didn't bring it back. You awakened it, asterisk. Alex's heart raced. What did that mean? He tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt like lead. The world around him was a blur, his senses overwhelmed by the cold, the fear, and the weight of everything he had seen and felt. The bell's hum still lingered faintly in the distance, vibrating through the very air as though calling to something or someone. What do you want from me? Alex managed to choke out, his voice hoarse from the cold. The figure didn't answer immediately. It seemed to consider his words, its head tilting slightly as if weighing its response. Alex's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What had he gotten himself into? Was this one of the creatures? Was it them? Slowly, the figure reached up and removed its hood, revealing its face. Alex's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't like the hollow-eyed figures he had seen before. There was nothing grotesque or monstrous about its face, at least not at first glance. The features were pale, almost translucent, and the eyes were the most unsettling part. They were black, entirely black, with no whites or irises, and they seemed to swallow the light around them, giving the impression that the figure wasn't truly there, but rather a part of the darkness itself. I am neither of them, nor am I of this world, the figure said, its voice echoing in Alex's mind. It spoke in a way that made his skull ache, as though its words were etched directly into his consciousness. Alex opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He was trapped in the figure's gaze, unable to break free of the weight of its presence. You must go back, the figure said softly, its voice both soothing and terrifying. You must finish what you started. Alex's pulse quickened. Back? Where? To the bell? The figure nodded slowly, its expression unreadable. To where it began. You must return to the source, the place where the veil is thinnest. The clearing, Alex murmured, his mind racing. The place I was just there. The figure's eyes never wavered from him. It is not the clearing that will save you. It is what you are willing to sacrifice to seal the rift you have opened. A cold shiver ran down Alex's spine. Sacrifice? What could he give? What could he possibly offer that would appease whatever dark force had been unleashed? I don't understand, Alex whispered, the confusion and fear overwhelming him. The figure stood, its movements slow and deliberate. You will. But time is short. The longer you wait, the stronger it becomes. The more it will claim. Alex's head swam. The words didn't make sense, not in the way he wanted them to. What did it mean, the more it will claim? Was this something even worse than the creatures? Was this the price he had to pay for disturbing the bell's slumber? Before Alex could voice his question, the figure stepped back into the mist, its form blurring until it disappeared entirely. The cold returned in full force, and Alex was left in the eerie silence of the forest, alone and shaking. The bell's hum was louder now, an almost deafening sound that seemed to rattle the very air around him. Alex clenched his fists, fighting the overwhelming urge to run. He couldn't go back. Not yet. He couldn't go back without understanding, without knowing exactly what kind of sacrifice he needed to make. But as the minutes dragged on and the hum grew louder, he realized something terrifying. Whatever the figure was, it wasn't offering answers. It was merely pushing him toward something darker, something that might consume him completely. And the worst part? Alex had no idea if he could stop it. With a deep, shaky breath, Alex stood, forcing his legs to carry him toward the clearing once more. This time he would go deeper. This time he would confront whatever waited at the heart of this nightmare. He would do whatever it took to end this, whatever the cost. Alex's mind buzzed with the figure's cryptic words as he made his way back toward the clearing. His body was numb from the cold, the chill of the forest seeping into his bones, but it was the unease crawling up his spine that gnawed at him. Every step felt like it could be his last, the trees looming overhead like silent watchers, their branches swaying in the wind with an unsettling rhythm. The hum of the bell was now a constant presence, vibrating through the very air, filling the space around him with a heavy, pulsating energy that pressed against his chest. Each step he took seemed to draw him closer to it, as if the bell itself was pulling him, urging him to come closer. His breath came in ragged gasps, fogging the air before him as he stumbled through the snow. The words of the figure echoed in his mind. Asterisk, the longer you wait, the stronger it becomes. The more it will claim. Asterisk, what did it mean by claim? He had no idea. But Alex had a sinking feeling that whatever it was coming for him. His feet slipped in the snow, and he staggered for a moment before regaining his balance. The forest was eerily silent now, the rustling of the trees muted, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Alex strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement, but all he could hear was the relentless hum of the bell. Suddenly, a shadow darted across his path, a quick flash of something too fast to be human. His heart skipped a beat and he froze. He strained his eyes, trying to see through the darkness, but nothing moved. The only sound now was the crackling of his breath in the cold air. Alex didn't move. He stood stock still, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and fear. But deep down he knew better. The forest wasn't quiet. It was waiting. "Who's there?" Alex called out, his voice trembling more than he intended. No answer. The shadows deepened and the bell's hum grew louder. But it wasn't just a hum anymore. It had taken on a more distinct, rhythmic quality, almost like a beating heart. Thud, thud, thud. And then in the distance, a low, guttural sound, like something dragging itself through the snow. The hairs on the back of Alex's neck stood up. He turned toward the sound, his heart racing in his chest. For a moment he thought he saw something, movement but fleeting. Something hunched and twisted, too large to be a person. His pulse quickened. He couldn't just stand here. He had to keep moving. He had no choice. He started to walk faster, but the sound followed him, growing louder with every step he took. It was drawing nearer, whatever it was. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee, but something kept him rooted to the spot, fear locking him in place. It was like the forest itself had turned against him, each branch, each gust of wind conspiring to hold him back. And then, through the trees he saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, emerging from the shadows. Its face was obscured by a dark, tattered cloak, but there was something distinctly wrong about it. It wasn't human. It didn't move like a person. It moved with a fluidity that made it look more like a predator stalking its prey. Alex's stomach dropped. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. It simply reached out with a long, spindly arm, its fingers too long, too thin, like a twisted parody of a human hand. The air around it seemed to warp, the space vibrating with a tension that made Alex's skin crawl. Without thinking, Alex turned and ran. He had no plan, no clear direction. He just had to escape. He could hear the figure moving behind him, its footsteps quiet but deliberate. It was close now. Too close. His breath was coming in ragged bursts, each inhalation burning his lungs. His legs screamed with fatigue, but he didn't stop. Not yet. The clearing was ahead, just a few more steps, and he could see the faint outline of the open space through the trees. But as he neared it, something even worse happened. The ground beneath his feet began to shift. The snow broke apart, revealing cracks in the earth, jagged and deep. Alex skidded to a stop, his eyes wide with panic. The cracks were spreading. They were opening up beneath him, swallowing the ground, widening with each passing second. He was trapped. A scream tore from his throat as he backed away from the edge, his eyes darting around for some kind of escape. The figure was still coming, closer now, its movements unnatural, its long limbs stretching out like spider legs. "Please," Alex whispered to himself, his voice shaking. "Please let me get out of here." But the earth didn't care. It didn't listen. The cracks continued to spread, and in the distance, the bell's hum had become a deafening roar, drowning out everything else. And then, from the depths of the ground, something emerged. A shadow, a hulking mass that seemed to rise from the cracks themselves, its form obscured by the darkness, but Alex could feel its presence. It was wrong, everything about it was wrong. Its very being seemed to distort the air around it, the space warping like a nightmare. The figure that had been chasing him paused, standing motionless as the creature rose. It didn't seem afraid. In fact, it almost seemed to welcome the arrival of whatever this was. Alex couldn't breathe. His heart pounded in his chest, his legs trembling as the dark mass fully emerged from the ground. It towered above him, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, its body shifting and pulsing as if made from shadows themselves. The figure didn't move, but Alex could hear its voice, low, cold, and full of hunger. Asterisk, you awakened it, asterisk. Alex's body went numb as the figure's words sank in. This wasn't just some creature from the depths of the woods. This was something older, something far more ancient. Something that had been waiting for him. And he had no idea how to stop it. The ground beneath his feet gave way, and Alex screamed as he fell into the abyss below, the darkness swallowing him whole. The darkness was all-consuming, a thick, oppressive weight pressing in on all sides. Alex's body slammed against the cold, jagged walls of the abyss, his breath knocked out of him as he fell further into the inky void. The earth around him seemed to close in, the space tightening with each passing second, as though the world itself was trying to suffocate him. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, pain radiating up his spine. His chest felt tight as if the air itself had turned thick and difficult to breathe. He gasped, coughing as he scrambled to push himself up. But the darkness was overwhelming, suffocating him. His hands groped in front of him, but there was nothing, no ground, no wall, just empty air. The bell's hum was louder now. It vibrated through the air, a pulsating rhythmic sound that reverberated in his bones. The deeper he fell, the louder it became until it seemed to echo through his very soul. It was like the bell itself had become a heartbeat, slow, steady, and full of malice. Alex's mind raced as he tried to steady his breathing. He couldn't see. He couldn't hear anything except the hum and the endless blackness surrounding him. Was this it? Had he fallen into some kind of endless pit, a void that had no escape? He didn't know, but the feeling of being utterly trapped in the unknown sent waves of panic crashing over him. Is this how it ends? He thought. Is this what I deserve? But then, out of the darkness, something shifted. A sound, soft at first but growing louder with each passing second, began to break the monotony of the hum. It was a low, guttural growl, like something waking from a deep slumber. Alex froze. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but the growl seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't just a growl, it was a voice, low and rasping, distorted by the very air itself. Alex could feel the words rather than hear them, a sense of dread crawling up his spine. Asterisk, you woke it. Now you will see what it wants, asterisk. The voice was like ice, cold, harsh, and cutting straight through him. Alex's heart began to pound in his chest. The bell, the figure, the creatures. It had all been leading him to this moment. He hadn't just disturbed something that had been dormant. He had awakened it. And now it was coming for him. Suddenly, the ground beneath Alex began to shift. It wasn't just the air that moved, it was the very earth itself, like something was rising from beneath him. His eyes widened as the darkness around him began to warp and twist, shapes forming in the gloom, unnatural shapes as if the shadows were alive. He scrambled back, but the ground was giving way. He tried to stand to find his footing, but his legs gave out from under him. And then he saw it. From the depths of the darkness, a figure emerged. At first, it was just a blur, a shadow against the pitch-black background, but it moved toward him, growing clearer with each passing second. It was tall, taller than any human. It had long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out of the shadows like grotesque arms, fingers reaching out toward him with unnatural speed. Its face. It didn't have a face in the way Alex understood it. It was a mass of shifting shadows, a blank, empty void that seemed to suck in the light around it. The only thing that was visible were its eyes, two glowing, piercing orbs that burned with an unnatural light, a cold fire that seemed to freeze the very air it touched. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He tried to move, to run, but his limbs felt like they were made of lead. He was paralyzed by the sight of the creature, the sheer impossibility of it. But the creature didn't move to strike immediately. It just stood there, its presence looming over him, its glowing eyes locked on his. Asterisk, you have awakened me, asterisk, the creature rasped, its voice echoing in Alex's mind, its words not spoken but felt. The weight of them pressed down on him, suffocating him in an invisible grip. Asterisk, you will not escape now, asterisk. Alex's mind spun. He had been right. All along, he had known there was something wrong about the bell, about the creatures, about the forest. But now, in the presence of this thing, he understood the true horror of it. This wasn't just a monster. This wasn't just something from the woods. This was something older. Something that had existed before even the forest, before the land itself. Asterisk, you are the keen, asterisk, the creature whispered, its voice like the creaking of ancient wood. Asterisk, the bell was but a warning, a test. Now, you will be my vessel, asterisk. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what the creature meant, but it didn't matter. He could feel it in his bones, the truth of it, the inevitability of it. He was no longer in control of his own fate. No, Alex gasped, struggling to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. The bell's hum grew louder, its vibrations rattling his teeth, his skull. The creature stepped forward, its long, twisted limbs reaching out. It touched his chest with cold fingers, and Alex could feel a wave of energy, dark, terrifying energy, flow through him. The air around him crackled with power, the ground trembling beneath his feet. And then, in an instant, everything went black. Alex's mind screamed as he felt his consciousness begin to slip away, the darkness consuming him completely. His body was no longer his own. It was being taken, used, twisted into something else. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was the bell's sound, louder than ever, deafening, filling his ears with its relentless, echoing hum. And then there was nothing. The stillness was overwhelming. For what seemed like an eternity, Alex's mind floated in the void, untethered, lost to everything. It was like he had ceased to exist, his consciousness suspended in some unfathomable space. There was no sound, no light, nothing except the oppressive silence that stretched on forever. But slowly the silence began to crack, a low hum echoing through the emptiness, faint at first but growing louder. The bell's sound. The same rhythmic, pulsing hum that had haunted him from the very beginning. It reverberated through the void, filling every corner of his being. It was familiar, but it wasn't comforting. It wasn't a sign of hope. It was a reminder of everything that had brought him here, to this moment. Alex's mind began to stir. At first it was just a flicker, a tiny spark in the vast dark, but soon the flicker grew into awareness. He could feel something in his chest, something cold, something unnatural. It was as if his own heartbeat was no longer his own. It was erratic, distant, and yet somehow, it echoed the same unsettling rhythm as the bell. Where am I? Alex tried to speak, but his voice felt like it was trapped, buried deep inside him. It was as if his very being had been hollowed out. He tried to move, to regain control, but there was nothing. His body didn't respond. Then the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and in the absence of sound, a new presence emerged. It was subtle at first, like a shadow creeping just beyond his vision, but it grew, filling the space around him with a malevolent energy. Alex could feel it, a force, a presence that had been waiting for him, that had always been waiting for him. A cold wind whispered through the void, but it wasn't a wind at all. It was the breath of something ancient, something that had never truly rested. Alex felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as a voice, low and guttural, slithered into his mind. Asterisk, you thought you could escape, asterisk, it said, its words like a rasping whisper, curling around him, suffocating him. Asterisk, but there is no escape from what you have awakened. There is no turning back now, asterisk. The voice was familiar, but Alex couldn't place it. It was as if it had always been there, lurking at the edges of his awareness, waiting for this moment to make itself known. It was everywhere, inside his mind, around him, within him. There was nowhere to hide from it. Who are you? Alex's voice was weak, barely a whisper, but he had to know. He needed to understand what was happening to him. The voice seemed to chuckle, a low, bone-chilling sound that rattled his very soul. Asterisk, who am I? Asterisk, it echoed. Asterisk, I am the one who has always been. The one who has been bound, waiting for the moment when the bell would ring again. The one you have freed, asterisk. Alex's heart skipped a beat. The bell. The figure. The forest. It all made sense now. You're the one from the bell. He didn't know why he said it, but the words spilled out before he could stop them. Asterisk, yes, asterisk. The voice seemed to grow in strength, its power wrapping around him like chains. Asterisk, I am the bell. The bell is me. And now you are mine, asterisk. A sharp, icy pain shot through Alex's chest, and he gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His chest felt as though it was being crushed, his lungs unable to fill with air. The sensation was overwhelming, but what terrified him more than the pain was the realization that this wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something spiritual. The creature. The thing that had followed him, that had been waiting for him. It had taken root in him. It was inside of him now, and it was growing stronger with every passing second. He could feel it, its power, its presence, creeping through his veins, flooding his thoughts, taking over his mind. No! Alex's voice trembled as he struggled to fight back the growing terror that was consuming him. I won't let you take me. The voice laughed again, this time louder, more menacing. Asterisk, you think you have a choice? Asterisk, it hissed. Asterisk, you opened the door. You invited me in. Now you will serve me. You are mine, just as the forest is mine, and all that exists will bend to my will. Asterisk. Alex's mind raced, his thoughts tangled in a blur of fear and confusion. He couldn't let this thing take over. He couldn't let it win. But how could he fight something that had already sunk its claws so deep into him? How could he fight when he no longer even knew what was real and what was a nightmare? Suddenly, a sharp, blinding light erupted from within him, searing through the darkness like a beacon. It wasn't his own doing, it wasn't something he had willed. It was as if something inside him had finally awakened, a force fighting back against the creature's influence. But it was weak, flickering like a candle in the wind. Asterisk, you cannot resist me. Asterisk, the voice warned, its tone dripping with malice. Asterisk, I am everything. You are nothing. Asterisk. The light grew stronger, brighter, and with it came a deep, resonating sound, like a crack, a rift opening between two worlds. Alex felt the ground beneath him shift, the space around him trembling. The darkness that had held him captive for so long began to break apart, the edges fraying like paper caught in a flame. And then, in the heart of the light, something emerged. A figure. It wasn't the creature. It wasn't the thing from the bell. It was something else, something that seemed to defy everything Alex knew. It was a person, but not in the way Alex understood. It was like a mirror image of himself, but twisted, fractured. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing with the same intensity as the light, but with something else behind them, something familiar. Asterisk, you can fight it. Asterisk, the figure spoke, its voice clear, but somehow distant, as if it were speaking from beyond a veil. Asterisk, you can still choose. Asterisk. Alex's heart surged with hope, and for the first time he felt like he might have a chance to escape this nightmare. The figure's presence was calm, like a steady hand guiding him through the storm. But the voice of the creature still echoed in his mind. Asterisk, you cannot escape. Asterisk. The battle had only just begun, and Alex knew he was running out of time. The light flickered and sputtered, like a flame in the wind, struggling to stay alive. Alex's heart raced, the battle within him escalating with every passing second. The figure that had appeared in the light wasn't just some illusion. It was real, or at least it felt real. There was a sense of familiarity in its presence, as if it had always been there, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But the creature's voice, low, mocking, and relentless, continued to reverberate in Alex's mind. Asterisk, you cannot win, Alex. You belong to me now. Your light is nothing against my darkness. Asterisk. He could feel it, something deep within, a power that was being drawn from him, from every corner of his soul, as the creature's grip tightened. The light that had sparked from within him flickered again, and Alex could feel himself being pulled toward the darkness. His body felt as if it was being torn in two, caught between the force of the light and the crushing weight of the shadow. But the figure, the twisted reflection of himself, stepped forward, its eyes glowing with intensity. Asterisk, you still have a choice. Asterisk. The words were like a lifeline, a last thread of hope that Alex could cling to. But the darkness was closing in, creeping up around him like a wall. The bell's hum was deafening now, its rhythmic pulse vibrating through his very being, drowning out everything else. Alex's breath came in shallow gasps, his vision blurring as the battle raged on inside of him. The creature, its presence overwhelming, whispered again, its voice seeping into his very thoughts. Asterisk, you cannot escape me. You cannot escape what you have awakened. Asterisk. His chest constricted with fear, but the figure's voice, calm and steady, cut through the chaos. Asterisk, remember who you are. Asterisk. Alex didn't understand at first. He was lost, a stranger to himself. But then, something clicked. A memory, a flicker of who he once was before the bell, before the darkness took hold. He wasn't just some puppet to be controlled. He had fought for his life, for his family, for everything he believed in. He wasn't going to give that up without a fight. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Alex pushed back, forcing himself to focus on the light, on the presence of the figure. He wasn't alone. He could feel something, some spark of resistance deep inside of him. He reached for it, and just as the darkness seemed ready to consume him whole, he found it, the key to his survival. The creature's laugh filled the void, its confidence unwavering. Asterisk, you think you can resist? Asterisk. Alex's hands trembled, but he forced himself to stand. He wasn't going to let this thing control him. Not anymore. The light in his chest burned brighter, expanding outward, pushing back against the dark, fighting against the weight that had held him in its grip for so long. It wasn't just the creature that was threatening him, it was everything, the bell, the forest, the madness that had taken over his life. But now, Alex could feel the energy building within him, something primal, something ancient that he could use. The shadow seemed to recoil, its form flickering as though it were afraid. Alex's pulse quickened, and he stepped forward, forcing himself through the growing pressure, the intense pull of the darkness trying to drag him down again. The figure, his twisted reflection, nodded. Asterisk, you can do it. You are stronger than it knows, asterisk. The creature growled, its voice shifting, becoming more frantic. Asterisk, no, you belong to me. This world belongs to me, asterisk. But Alex didn't back down. He couldn't afford to. The light in his chest surged with power, and he felt it. His soul, his very being, becoming one with it, feeding it, giving it strength. The bell's hum, that terrible sound that had haunted him, seemed to fade as the light enveloped him completely. The darkness, once all-consuming, began to recede, its hold on him weakening. The creature's presence, its terrifying form, twisted and flickered like a dying flame. Alex could feel its power faltering, like a beast gasping for breath, desperate to survive. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the creature's voice fell silent. The hum of the bell stopped, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. Alex collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his body trembling. He had done it. The darkness had been pushed back. But he knew it wasn't over. This was only a temporary victory. He looked around, but the void had disappeared. The light had taken over, and in its warmth, he could finally see something. Something beyond the suffocating blackness that had surrounded him for so long. It was the forest. The trees, the path he had once walked, the familiar landscape that had become a nightmare. It was all back, but it wasn't the same. The trees stood silent, like watchers in the distance, their branches stretching toward him like hands ready to pull him back into the void. The ground beneath him felt solid, but there was a lingering sense of unease, like something was still wrong, still waiting. And then, in the distance, he saw it, the bell. It wasn't just a sound now. It was an object, hanging in the air, suspended, its dull silver surface gleaming in the light. But something wasn't right about it. It had changed. The bell wasn't just an object anymore. It was a living thing, pulsating, its surface rippling like water. The force that had once controlled him now seemed to call to him, beckoning him to come closer. Alex didn't move. He couldn't. Something inside him told him that if he reached for it, if he let it take him again, he would never escape. The creature's whispers echoed in his mind once more, but now they were distant, fading, as if the connection between them was breaking. But the bell was still there, calling to him. He knew that whatever happened next, it would be the final test, the final choice. He could run. He could walk away and leave the bell behind. But could he ever truly escape? Or would he be drawn back into the nightmare, forever bound to the forces that had been awakened? He had only one choice left. Alex's legs felt like they were made of stone as he stood, rooted to the spot. The bell shimmered before him, its rhythmic pulse calling to him in a way that both terrified and intrigued him. The light that had enveloped him was still burning brightly, but it seemed to waver now, its intensity flickering in the presence of the bell. It was as though the bell was testing him, trying to find a crack, a weakness, something it could exploit. He swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. His mind screamed at him to run, to turn around and never look back. But something in him, a deep, primal instinct, told him he couldn't leave. Not yet. The bell wasn't just a symbol of the horror he had faced. It was a part of him now, a mark on his soul that couldn't be erased. It was a reminder of everything he had survived, everything he had lost, and everything he still stood to lose. The creature's voice echoed in his mind once more, low and guttural. Asterisk, you can never escape me, Alex. I will always be here, lurking in the shadows of your mind, watching, waiting, asterisk. His heart pounded in his chest, but the words of the twisted reflection of himself from before, those final words, still lingered in his mind. Asterisk, you are stronger than it knows, asterisk. Alex's hands clenched into fists, his nails biting into the skin of his palms. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew that whatever he chose to do now would determine everything. He could take the bell, let its power consume him completely, or he could turn away from it and face whatever lay beyond. The darkness wasn't gone, not entirely. It was still there, just beneath the surface, a whispering presence that would always haunt him. But now he had the light. He had the strength. It was time to make his stand. With a deep breath, Alex stepped forward. The bell pulsed in response, its rippling surface shimmering in the light as though it recognized his approach. It was close now, within reach. He could feel its presence, feel its power trying to pull him in, to control him once again. But this time he wouldn't let it. This time he would be the one in control. He extended his hand, his fingers trembling as they hovered just above the bell's surface. The air around him grew heavy, thick with the tension of the moment. His heart raced, the beat quickening as he drew closer to his final choice. The bell's surface seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow, and for a moment, Alex thought he saw something inside it. A face, a shadow, an entity that reached out with invisible hands trying to drag him in. But he fought it, pushing back with every ounce of strength he had left. You belong to me, the creature's voice growled in the back of his mind, like a curse being whispered directly into his soul. You are mine. Always, But Alex's resolve didn't waver. He could feel the power of the light, that spark deep inside him, growing stronger, burning brighter. He wasn't going to give in. He wasn't going to let the darkness win. In a moment of sheer determination, Alex's fingers brushed against the bell. The instant his skin made contact with the surface, a shock of cold and pain jolted through him, like an electric current surging through his entire body. His breath caught in his throat, and for a split second he thought he might collapse. The darkness surged around him, wrapping him in its suffocating embrace, and the bell's hum grew louder, more insistent. But then something shifted. The light inside him flared, burning white-hot, pushing back against the darkness, against the bell's influence. It was like the bell itself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to make the choice. And as the light grew, it began to absorb the energy of the bell, its pulse slowing, its power dimming. The creature's voice, once so loud and commanding, faltered. No, it whispered, a tremor of fear creeping into its tone. You can't do this, But Alex didn't stop. He gritted his teeth and focused all his energy on the light inside him, drawing it out with everything he had. The pain intensified, but so did the power. The bell shuddered under the force of the light, its surface cracking as though it were being torn apart from within. The darkness, the creature's presence, began to fade, its grip loosening with every passing second. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the bell shattered. The sound was like 1,000 glass shards breaking at once, a high-pitched ringing that cut through the air. For a moment, Alex thought his eardrums would burst. But then there was silence. Complete and utter silence. The darkness had disappeared. Alex stood there, panting, his chest heaving as the last remnants of the nightmare faded away. The bell was gone, its shattered pieces nothing but dust and echoes in the wind. The air around him felt lighter, as though the weight of everything that had happened had been lifted. The forest, the path, the world around him, everything seemed different. He felt a sense of relief, but it was mixed with something else, a lingering unease. The fight wasn't over. The darkness might be gone for now, but Alex knew it could return as it always did. He couldn't let his guard down. Still, for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt free. The bell had been destroyed, and with it, the curse that had haunted him. But he knew one thing for certain. He had won. The bell was gone. But there were other battles, other forces waiting, and he would be ready. As Alex turned to leave the forest behind, a final, quiet voice echoed in the distance, almost imperceptible, like a whisper in the wind. You cannot escape forever, But Alex didn't stop. He didn't look back. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and something more, something old, something unsettling. Alex had thought that when the bell shattered, when the darkness finally retreated, he would be free. But the feeling that lingered in the air now told him otherwise. It was a presence, something unseen but always just on the edge of his perception, watching, waiting. His steps were heavy as he made his way through the forest, the path now clearer than before, as though the earth itself had rearranged to let him pass. There was no sign of the twisted figure that had haunted him, no dark shadows clinging to the edges of his vision. But the silence, it was oppressive, thick with an unspoken tension. It gnawed at the edges of his mind, a reminder that peace was never truly permanent in a world like this. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the creature to emerge from the trees, but the forest remained still. No movement, no sound, just the weight of the world pressing down on him. He could feel it. The bell's destruction had severed something. The hold it had on him was broken, but not the darkness itself. It was still out there somewhere, waiting. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the truth. He hadn't escaped. The fight hadn't ended. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Alex's thoughts raced as the path before him stretched out, endless, winding, disappearing into the shadow of the forest. The bell might be gone, but there were still remnants of its power lingering in the air, faint pulses of energy that seemed to beckon him forward. It wasn't a voice this time, but a force, an invisible pull urging him to continue. But where? And why? As if in answer to his unspoken question, the wind shifted, and a single leaf drifted from the trees, landing softly at his feet. But this wasn't just any leaf. The veins on its surface were etched with strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. Alex bent down to pick it up, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the leaf, feeling a sudden jolt of energy shoot through him. The symbols pulsed, alive with power, and for a moment, Alex could have sworn he saw a face in the patterns, familiar but not quite. It was then that the air around him seemed to change. The silence that had been so thick, so stifling, began to vibrate, like the world itself was coming alive again. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, as if unseen eyes were tracking his every move. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, and the trees around him, once so still, began to creak and groan as though they were waking from a long slumber. Alex's breath caught in his throat. Something was coming. Something worse than the darkness that had taken him before. And then, just as the realization hit him, a voice echoed in his mind. It was the same low, mocking tone from the creature he had faced before, the twisted reflection of himself. But this time there was something different about it. It was more insistent, more powerful. Asterisk, you cannot run, Alex, asterisk. The voice reverberated through his body, shaking him to his core. Asterisk, you cannot escape what you have awakened. The darkness is not gone. It was never gone. And now it will claim you, asterisk. Alex's stomach churned with dread as he clutched the leaf in his hand, its symbols still glowing faintly. The forest around him seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening, creeping toward him as if they had a life of their own. His chest tightened with fear, but something deep within him, something he couldn't explain, urged him to stand tall. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. The light inside him had not faded. It was still there, flickering, growing stronger with every passing moment. He had faced the bell, the creature, and the darkness before. He could do it again. But as the wind picked up, whipping through the trees, Alex heard something else, a faint sound in the distance. A ringing, barely audible but unmistakable. The bell. It was back. The sound grew louder, closer, like the tolling of a death knell. The air thickened with dread, but Alex refused to look back. He couldn't afford to. He had to face it head-on. The bell was calling, but he wouldn't answer. Not this time. The ground beneath him trembled as the shadows deepened, and from the corners of his vision, he saw them, figures moving between the trees. Dark, twisted shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as though they were made of the very shadows themselves. Alex's pulse quickened. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept walking. He had no choice. He couldn't stop. Not now. The figures moved closer, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, watching him, waiting for him to falter. But he didn't. He couldn't. The bell's ring grew louder, more insistent, its pull stronger. The ground shook beneath his feet, and he felt the darkness pressing in from all sides. It was coming for him again, but this time, Alex was ready. He could feel it deep within him, the power of the light, the force that had kept him going all this time. It wasn't just some fleeting hope. It was part of him. His soul, his will, his very essence. The darkness might try to swallow him whole, but it would never break him. With one last defiant step, Alex shouted into the darkness, his voice carrying over the howling wind. Asterisk, you will not have me, asterisk. The shadows recoiled, the figures faltering as though they had been struck. The air around him crackled with energy, the light inside him flaring brighter, fiercer than ever before. The bell's ringing faltered, its toll silenced by the force of his will. The darkness, for the first time, seemed to hesitate, uncertain, unsure. Alex stood firm, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath, but his eyes were resolute. He had faced the darkness and he had survived. The bell had tried to claim him, the creatures had tried to break him, but he was still here. And he always would be. The wind died down, the forest once again quiet. The figures were gone. The bell's ring was silenced. For now. Alex knew the darkness would return, it always did. But he also knew that he had the strength to face it, to fight it. And with that knowledge, he turned and walked away, the path ahead still uncertain, but the light inside him unwavering. The fight wasn't over. But Alex wasn't afraid. Story 2. The knock reverberated through the empty hallways, its sharpness cutting through the stillness of the house like a blade. Emily froze, her hand midair as she reached for her tea on the kitchen counter. It was late, too late for anyone to visit. The snowstorm outside howled against the windows, a chilling reminder that no one should even be out there. Her father's house had always felt safe, nestled in the quiet outskirts of town, miles away from the nearest neighbor. But tonight something felt off. The kind of off that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. For a moment she considered ignoring it. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks on her ears. Maybe a tree branch had fallen and scraped the side of the house. But the knock came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate taps. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and moved toward the front door. Each step felt heavier than the last, her heartbeat growing louder with every inch closer to the unknown. She paused before the door, her breath visible in the icy air seeping through the cracks. Peering through the frosted glass, she saw nothing. The porch light illuminated the swirling snow, but no figure stood there. Yet, as her eyes scanned downward, she spotted it, a small, crimson-wrapped package resting on the wooden planks. The paper shimmered unnaturally under the dim light, almost as if it were alive. Her hand trembled as she unlocked the door and opened it just enough to reach out. The cold hit her like a slap, stealing her breath. She snatched the package and shut the door quickly, locking it behind her. The package was light, almost weightless, and colder than the winter air. A tag dangled from a golden string tied around it. The handwriting on the note was jagged, as though written in a rush, or by a trembling hand. Asterisk, open me and everything you cherish will change forever. Asterisk. Emily stared at the note, her stomach twisting. It had to be some kind of prank, right? A cruel joke from a bored teenager or an eccentric neighbor. But the weight of those words pressed against her chest like an invisible force. She placed the package on the coffee table and took a step back, crossing her arms tightly around herself as if trying to shield against the growing unease. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. She tried to shake it off, tried to convince herself that this was nothing. Just a silly gift, a meaningless coincidence. But deep down she felt it, an unshakable pull toward the package. Emily? Her father's voice drifted down the stairs, frail and groggy. She turned toward the sound, relieved for the distraction. Yeah, Dad. It's just me, she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. Go back to sleep. There was no response, just the faint creak of his bed as he shifted. Emily took a deep breath and looked back at the package. Curiosity gnawed at her, stronger than fear. Slowly, she sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers brushing against the smooth crimson paper. When she finally unwrapped it, the ornament inside caught the light from the fire, casting shimmering patterns across the walls. It was beautiful, delicate and intricate, with etchings so fine they almost seemed impossible to create by human hands. Then the whispers started. At first, they were soft, almost indistinguishable from the crackle of the fire. But they grew louder, forming words in a language she didn't recognize. They came from everywhere, bouncing off the walls, surrounding her. Emily dropped the ornament in panic, but it didn't break. Instead, it rolled across the floor and came to a stop, pointing directly at the fireplace. Her breath hitched as the flames grew brighter, fiercer, almost blinding. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows dancing wildly, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. And then, through the roaring fire, she saw it. Her mother's face. It was fleeting, like a reflection in a disturbed pond. But it was her, unmistakably her. The same soft eyes, the same gentle smile. Emily's chest tightened, and she stumbled back, clutching the armrest of the couch for support. Mom, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The fire responded, flaring violently before dimming to its original glow. The room fell silent again, but the whispers lingered in the corners of her mind, refusing to leave. Emily stared at the ornament, now lying motionless on the floor. It seemed ordinary again, nothing more than a pretty decoration. But she knew better. Whatever this was, it wasn't ordinary. And it wasn't over. Emily couldn't sleep. She tried, lying in bed, eyes squeezed shut, counting the seconds between the creaks and groans of the old house. But her thoughts kept circling back to the ornament and what she'd seen in the flames. Her mother's face. It couldn't have been real. The rational part of her brain kept repeating that it was just her mind playing tricks, a cruel hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. But another part, the one that felt that unnatural pull when she first touched the gift, knew better. She sat up in bed, her eyes darting to the clock. 2:37 a.m. The world outside was silent except for the faint whistle of wind. She glanced at her door, half expecting to see shadows moving beneath it, but the hallway was dark and still. Unable to fight the nagging feeling any longer, Emily threw on her robe and crept downstairs. The living room was cold, the fire long extinguished. The ornament still lay on the floor, exactly where she'd left it. She approached it cautiously, her steps light on the creaking floorboards. The glass surface shimmered faintly, reflecting the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. Kneeling, she hesitated before picking it up again. This time, she noticed something she hadn't before. Tiny symbols etched into the glass, barely visible unless held at the right angle. They weren't random. The shapes were precise, deliberate, like ancient runes or a forgotten language. As her fingers traced the patterns, the whispers returned. They were softer now, less chaotic, almost inviting. She recoiled, dropping the ornament onto the couch. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the room in oppressive silence. Emily? Her name came from behind her, spoken in a voice so faint she wasn't sure she'd heard it. She spun around, her heart hammering. The room was empty. "Dad?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She moved toward the stairs, her legs shaking. The second floor was darker than she remembered, the shadows seeming to stretch and thicken as she climbed. She reached her father's bedroom and pushed the door open gently. He was lying in bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, steady breaths. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. She noticed something strange, a small, folded piece of paper clutched in his hand. "Dad?" she whispered, stepping closer. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Don't open it," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Emily froze. "What? Don't open what?" But before she could get an answer, his eyes closed again, his breathing deepening as he fell back into sleep. She hesitated, then gently pried the paper from his hand. It was old, yellowed at the edges, with the same jagged handwriting as the note on the package. Asterisk, the first step has been taken. Do not trust what you see. The truth lies in the light. Asterisk. Emily stared at the note, her pulse quickening. What did it mean? Was it connected to the ornament? And who had left it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a soft hum coming from downstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable, like a melody being played on an old music box. She swallowed hard, clutching the note tightly as she descended the stairs. The living room was empty, but the sound grew louder as she approached the fireplace. The ornament was glowing now, faintly at first, but the light grew stronger as the melody reached its peak. Emily felt drawn to it again, an invisible force pulling her closer. She picked it up, the glass warm against her skin. As soon as her fingers closed around it, the room seemed to shift. The walls stretched impossibly high, the furniture warped into strange, unrecognizable shapes. The air grew thick, heavy, making it hard to breathe, and then she was no longer in the living room. She stood in a snow-covered forest, the trees towering above her like skeletal giants. The air was eerily still, the snow undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading deeper into the woods. "Emily," the voice called again, clearer this time. She turned, but no one was there. The footprints seemed to beckon her, leading her toward a faint light in the distance. She hesitated, fear warring with curiosity. But something told her she had no choice. Clutching the ornament tightly, she took a step forward. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she followed the trail, the light growing brighter with each step. It wasn't until she reached the clearing that she realized the light was coming from a cabin. small and unassuming, with smoke curling from its chimney. A sense of dread settled over her as she approached. The door creaked open before she could knock, revealing a dark interior. "Come in," the voice said, softer now, almost coaxing. Emily stepped inside, her breath catching as the door slammed shut behind her. The cabin was empty, but on the table in the center of the room lay another package, identical to the one she'd received. This one was unwrapped, revealing an object that made her blood run cold. It was a photograph of her family, her mother, her father, and herself as a child. But their faces were wrong, distorted, their eyes replaced with hollow black voids. And beneath the photograph was another note. Asterisk, you cannot go back. The game has begun. Asterisk. Emily stared at the note, her fingers trembling as she clutched the photograph. The faces in the picture were so wrong, so deeply unsettling, that it felt like they were staring back at her through those hollow voids. She wanted to look away, to drop the image and run, but her feet wouldn't move. Her hands wouldn't let go. The whispers returned, louder now, circling her like a cold wind in the room. They were no longer just words, they were voices. Familiar voices. "Emily," one whispered. It sounded like her mother. "No," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "This isn't real. None of this is real." But the room seemed to disagree. The shadows stretched, twisting and curling like living creatures, while the fire in the corner of the cabin flickered unnaturally, casting an eerie glow on the walls. The whispers morphed into laughter, mocking, chilling, and coming from everywhere at once. The ornament in her pocket pulsed with warmth, drawing her attention back to it. She pulled it out, her hands trembling as the glass began to glow faintly once more. The etchings on its surface shifted, rearranging themselves into something new, something that looked like a map. Emily leaned closer, squinting at the tiny details. The map showed a series of locations, but none of them made sense. There were no labels, no landmarks she recognized. Just a series of intersecting lines and what looked like a path leading to an X marked deep in the center. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly the fire in the cabin roared to life. Emily jumped, stumbling back as the flames leapt unnaturally high, nearly licking the wooden ceiling. Shapes began to form in the fire, faces distorted and screaming silently. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice breaking. The fire obeyed, shrinking back to a faint flicker. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of floorboards behind her. Emily froze. "Who's there?" she demanded, spinning around. At first there was nothing but darkness. Then, from the farthest corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was cloaked in shadows, its movements slow and deliberate. Emily couldn't make out its features, but the way it moved, the slight tilt of its head, the unnatural way its limbs bent, made her skin crawl. The figure stopped a few feet away, its presence heavy and suffocating. "Leave," it said, its voice deep and hollow. Emily's grip on the ornament tightened. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it extended a hand, long and skeletal, pointing directly at the photograph still clutched in her other hand. "Take it back," the figure hissed. "You never should have touched it." "What does that mean?" Emily demanded, her fear giving way to frustration. "What's happening to me? Why am I here?" The figure tilted its head again, as if considering her question. Then it took a step closer, its form towering over her. "You opened the door," it said simply. "And now it won't close." Emily's mind raced. "The door? What door?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, faster than she could react, and touched the ornament in her hand. The moment its fingers made contact, a wave of heat surged through her body, and the world around her dissolved. She was falling. The cabin, the figure, the fire, they all disappeared, replaced by a blur of light and shadow. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. When she opened her eyes, she wasn't in the cabin anymore. She was back in the living room of her father's house. The fireplace was cold, the room eerily quiet. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, a vivid, horrifying dream. But the photograph in her hand and the glowing ornament told her otherwise. Emily stumbled to her feet, her body aching from the fall. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was still 2:37 a.m. How was that possible? It felt like hours had passed in the cabin. Her father's voice called out from upstairs, startling her. "Emily? Are you okay?" She hesitated. His voice sounded normal, but something about it felt off. "I'm fine," she called back, her voice shaky. "Just go back to sleep." But instead of silence, she heard footsteps descending the stairs. Emily's chest tightened as her father appeared at the top of the staircase. He looked the same, tired, frail, but his eyes were different. They were dark, almost black, and his movements were unnaturally stiff. "Dad?" she whispered, taking a step back. He didn't respond. He just stared at her, his head tilting slightly the way the figure in the cabin had. "You shouldn't have brought it here," he said, his voice echoing strangely. Emily's heart pounded. "Brought what?" His gaze dropped to the ornament in her hand. "That," he said. "It doesn't belong here. You need to take it back." Emily shook her head, her grip tightening around the glass. "I don't even know what this is. Why is this happening?" "What do you mean, take it back?" Her father's expression didn't change. "The game has rules, Emily. You broke them. And now they're coming." Her stomach churned. "Who's coming?" But before he could answer, the house shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to move, stretching and writhing like living creatures. Emily stumbled back, clutching the ornament to her chest. Her father, or whatever he was, stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on her. "You need to leave," he said calmly, even as the chaos around them grew. "Leave? Where?" The house shook again, and the front door blew open, revealing a wall of swirling snow outside. The wind howled, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and unnatural. Emily's father pointed to the door. "Follow the path. It will lead you to the end." Her pulse raced. The end of what? The only way to stop this. Another violent tremor rocked the house, and the walls began to crack. Emily had no choice. She ran for the door, the icy wind cutting into her skin as she stepped outside. The world beyond the house was unrecognizable. The snow-covered forest stretched endlessly in all directions, the trees taller and more twisted than before. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, was the glow of the cabin. The path was clear now, the snow undisturbed except for her footprints. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, and they were following her. The forest was alive with sound, not the natural rustling of leaves or the chirping of winter birds, but something deeper, more sinister. The whispers trailed Emily like a predator stalking its prey, weaving through the trees and brushing against her ears. They were louder now, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony, their words fragmented but unmistakably urgent. Asterisk, turn back. Asterisk, asterisk, keep going. Asterisk, asterisk, it's too late. Asterisk, asterisk, they're watching you. Asterisk. Emily's breath came in short, sharp gasps, the icy air biting at her lungs. The path ahead stretched endlessly, flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in on her the further she walked. Their branches reached out like skeletal arms, their shadows moving unnaturally in the dim glow of the cabin's light in the distance. Her mind raced as she clutched the ornament tightly against her chest. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to drop it, to toss it into the snow and run. But even as fear clawed at her, a strange sense of duty kept her moving forward. The whispers grew louder, more aggressive, their tone shifting from pleading to angry. The voices clashed and overlapped, creating a dizzying storm of sound that made it hard to think. Emily stumbled, her foot catching on an exposed root, and she fell hard into the snow. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own labored breathing and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. She pushed herself up on her elbows, the cold seeping through her clothes, and froze. There were footprints in the snow beside her, large, heavy, and fresh. But they weren't hers. Emily's eyes darted around, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The trees loomed over her, their gnarled branches swaying in a wind she couldn't feel. Then she heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate in her chest. She turned her head slowly, every instinct screaming at her not to, and saw it. At first it was just a shadow, darker than the others and impossibly tall. But as it moved closer, its form became clearer. The creature was hunched, its elongated limbs moving with unnatural fluidity. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over sharp, angular bones, and its face, or what passed for a face, was featureless except for two glowing eyes that burned like embers. The growl rumbled again, and the creature took another step toward her, its massive footprints matching the ones beside her. Emily scrambled to her feet, the ornament clutched tightly in her trembling hand. The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes fixed on her. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice breaking. The creature paused as if considering her words, then let out a guttural laugh, a deep, mocking sound that sent chills down her spine. It lunged. Emily didn't think. She ran, her feet slipping and sliding in the snow as the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than before. The creature's footsteps thundered behind her, each one shaking the ground. The path twisted and turned, but Emily didn't dare look back. The light from the cabin grew brighter with each step, a beacon cutting through the oppressive darkness. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. Emily slowed, her chest heaving as she risked a glance over her shoulder. The creature was gone. The forest was still, the only sound the crunch of her boots in the snow. The cabin was close now, its warm light spilling out into the cold night. But as Emily approached, she realized it wasn't the same cabin she had seen before. This one was larger, its walls covered in strange, pulsating vines that glowed faintly in the darkness. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Emily hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But something was pulling her forward, an invisible force that made her legs move even as her mind begged them to stop. The inside of the cabin was cold and empty, the air heavy with a metallic scent that made her stomach churn. The walls were covered in the same glowing vines, their light casting eerie patterns across the floor. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table lay another object. Emily approached cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The object was covered with a thin cloth, its shape obscured. Her fingers trembled as she reached out and pulled the cloth away. It was a mirror. The frame was ornate, carved from dark wood and covered in the same runes as the ornament. But the glass itself was strange, its surface rippling like water, reflecting not her face but something else entirely. Her mother. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The image in the mirror was unmistakably her mother, but she looked different. Her eyes were wide with fear, her face pale and gaunt. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. "Mom?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. The image flickered, her mother's expression growing more desperate. She raised a hand, pointing at something behind Emily. Emily turned, her breath catching in her throat. The creature was there, standing in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on her. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The ornament in Emily's hand began to glow again, brighter than ever, and the runes on its surface pulsed with an otherworldly light. The creature let out a deafening roar, its long limbs clawing at the air as it charged toward her. Without thinking, Emily raised the ornament and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. The creature stopped mid-charge, its body convulsing as the light from the shattered mirror filled the room. Emily shielded her eyes, the brightness blinding. When the light faded, the creature was gone, and the room was silent once more. The shards of the mirror lay scattered across the floor, each one reflecting a different image. In one, Emily saw the cabin as it was before, warm, inviting, and safe. In another, she saw the twisted forest, dark and menacing. And in the largest shard, she saw herself. But it wasn't her. The reflection stared back with hollow, black eyes, its lips curling into a sinister smile. The shard began to glow, and before Emily could react, the world around her dissolved into darkness. Emily awoke to the sound of bells, soft, rhythmic chimes that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. She blinked, her vision blurry and unfocused, the world around her shrouded in an eerie gray mist. The air was thick and cold, carrying a faint metallic scent that made her stomach churn. She sat up slowly, her head pounding. The shards of the mirror were gone, as was the cabin. She was in the middle of the forest again, but it was different this time. The trees were taller, their branches bare and twisted like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. The ground was covered in a thick layer of frost, glittering faintly in the pale light of a moon that seemed impossibly large and close. And the bells. They were louder now, their haunting melody cutting through the silence. Emily stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, and looked around. The path she had been following was gone, replaced by a maze of tangled roots and thick fog. She clutched the ornament tightly, its glow faint but persistent, and began to walk. The forest seemed alive, its shadows shifting and pulsing with every step she took. Whispers flitted through the air, faint and fragmented, just on the edge of her hearing. Asterisk, don't stop. Asterisk, asterisk, they're waiting. Asterisk, asterisk, you're almost there. Asterisk. The words made no sense, but they filled her with a sense of urgency she couldn't ignore. She quickened her pace, the bells growing louder with each step. After what felt like hours, she reached a clearing. In the center stood a towering, ancient tree, its trunk wide enough to house a small building. Its bark was dark and cracked, and its branches stretched high into the sky, their tips vanishing into the mist. Hanging from the tree's branches were dozens of ornaments, each one glowing faintly in the darkness. They swayed gently in an invisible breeze, their light casting eerie patterns on the ground below. Emily approached cautiously, her breath visible in the icy air. As she got closer, she noticed that each ornament was different. Some were cracked, others pristine, but all of them bore the same strange runes as the one in her hand. At the base of the tree was a small wooden box, its lid slightly ajar. Emily knelt down and opened it, revealing a collection of old, yellowed photographs. She picked one up, her hands trembling. It was a picture of her family. Her parents stood in front of their old house, smiling at the camera. Emily was there too, a toddler in her mother's arms. But as she stared at the image, she noticed something was wrong. The background was distorted, the trees behind them twisted and dark. And there, in the shadows, was the creature. Its glowing eyes were unmistakable, its form barely visible but undeniably there. Emily's heart raced as she flipped through the rest of the photos. Each one was a snapshot of her life. Birthdays, holidays, ordinary moments. And in every single one, the creature was there, lurking in the background. She dropped the photos, her hands shaking. The sound of the bells grew louder, and Emily looked up. The ornaments on the tree were glowing brighter now, their light pulsating in time with the chimes. The runes on the ornament in her hand began to shift, rearranging themselves into a pattern she couldn't decipher. Then, from behind the tree, a figure emerged. It wasn't the creature. This figure was human, or at least it appeared to be. A man, tall and thin, dressed in a tattered black coat. His face was pale, almost skeletal, and his eyes were deep-set and shadowed. "You made it," he said, his voice cold and hollow. Emily took a step back, clutching the ornament tightly. "Who are you? What is this place?" The man tilted his head, studying her with a faint, unsettling smile. "This is where it begins, and where it ends." "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice shaking. He gestured to the tree. "The ornaments, they're pieces of a puzzle, fragments of what was taken. Each one holds a memory, a moment, a choice. And you," his eyes fixed on her, piercing and unrelenting, "you hold the last piece." Emily glanced down at the ornament in her hand. "What do you mean? Why me?" The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "Because you're the one who opened the door." Emily shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't understand. What door? I didn't open anything." "Didn't you?" the man said, his tone mocking. "The ornament, the photograph, the cabin. Every choice you've made has brought you here. And now it's time to finish what you started." The bells grew louder, their chimes reverberating through the clearing. The ornaments on the tree began to glow brighter, their light blinding. Emily shielded her eyes, her heart pounding. When the light faded, the man was gone. But the tree had changed. Its bark was no longer dark and cracked. Instead, it was smooth and polished, its surface etched with the same runes as the ornaments. And at its base, where the photographs had been, was a door. It was small, barely large enough for Emily to crawl through, and its surface shimmered like the glass of the mirror. The runes on the door glowed faintly, their light pulsing in time with the ornament in her hand. Emily stared at the door, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She didn't want to go through it. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run. But she knew she couldn't. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling her mind with fragmented voices. Asterisk, open it. Asterisk, asterisk, don't open it. Asterisk, asterisk, this is your only chance. Asterisk. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door. The moment her fingers touched its surface, the ornament in her hand shattered, its fragments dissolving into light. The door creaked open, revealing a swirling void of darkness. The air around her grew cold, and the whispers became a deafening roar. Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding. Then, with one final glance at the forest behind her, she stepped through the door. Emily's scream was swallowed by the void as the door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into absolute darkness. The world felt weightless, like she was falling endlessly through a bottomless chasm. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against her chest and making it hard to breathe. Then came the sound, a low droning hum that vibrated through her body, growing louder and louder until it was all she could hear. Just as she thought her eardrums would burst, the sound stopped and light exploded around her. She was no longer in the forest. Emily found herself standing in a room that defied logic. The walls, if they could even be called walls, were made of shifting, glowing patterns, swirling runes and pulsating shapes that seemed to writhe like living things. The floor beneath her feet was smooth and reflective like black glass, and the air was filled with the faint scent of burning pine. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat another ornament. This one was larger than the one she had carried, its surface a deep, blood-red hue that seemed to pulse like a beating heart. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her not to go near it. But before she could move, the room shifted. The patterns on the walls twisted violently, their glow intensifying until they formed shapes, faces. Dozens of them, all staring at her with hollow, empty eyes. They opened their mouths in unison, and a chorus of whispers filled the room. Asterisk, do you know what you've done? Asterisk, do you understand the cost? Asterisk, it's too late to turn back now. Emily clutched her head, the voices drilling into her mind like needles. Stop it. The whispers ceased abruptly, and the room fell silent. When Emily looked up, the faces were gone, and standing before the pedestal was the man from before, the one with the skeletal face and sharp teeth. Welcome back, he said, his voice smooth and chilling. Emily took a step back, her hands clenched into fists. What is this place? Why am I here? The man tilted his head, his hollow eyes glinting with amusement. You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about you. It was never about you. Then what is it about? Emily demanded. He gestured to the ornament on the pedestal. This, the final piece of the puzzle. The last memory. Emily stared at the ornament, her heart pounding. What do you mean, the last memory? The man's smile widened. Every choice you've made, every path you've taken has brought you here. This ornament holds the truth about what happened that night. About what you did. Emily's breath caught in her throat. What are you talking about? I didn't do anything. Didn't you? The man said, his tone mocking. Why don't you see for yourself? Before Emily could respond, the pedestal began to glow, and the room shifted again. The black glass floor dissolved, replaced by snow. The glowing walls faded, revealing the forest once more. But this time, it wasn't the same forest she had walked through before. The trees were covered in fresh snow, their branches heavy with icicles that sparkled in the moonlight. The air was crisp and still, and in the distance, Emily could see a familiar sight, the cabin. It was whole again, its warm light glowing invitingly through the windows. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint sound of laughter drifted through the air. Emily's heart twisted painfully as she recognized the voices. Her parents. Without thinking, she ran toward the cabin, her feet crunching in the snow. As she got closer, the laughter grew louder, mingling with the sound of faint music. She reached the front door and hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. The scene inside was one of perfect holiday cheer. The living room was warm and cozy, decorated with garlands and twinkling lights. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a soft glow over the room. Her parents were sitting on the couch, laughing and talking as they sipped hot cocoa. And there, in the corner, was a Christmas tree. It was tall and full, its branches adorned with ornaments that sparkled like jewels. But there was one ornament that stood out, a blood-red orb that pulsed faintly, just like the one on the pedestal. Emily stepped into the room, her heart pounding. Mom? Dad? Her parents didn't react. They didn't even seem to notice her. Mom? She shouted, her voice breaking. Still no response. It was as if she wasn't there. Then the room flickered and everything changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by an icy chill. The decorations faded and the fire in the fireplace sputtered out. The tree withered, its branches blackening and curling inward. And her parents? They were no longer laughing. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They sat motionless on the couch, their hands clutching empty mugs. Emily stumbled backward, her chest tightening with fear. What's happening? The man's voice echoed around her, cold and mocking. This is the truth you've been running from. The truth you've been trying to forget. No, Emily whispered, shaking her head. This isn't real. It can't be real. The man appeared beside the withered tree, his skeletal face twisted into a grin. Oh, it's real. And now it's time to remember. The red ornament on the tree began to glow, its light pulsating like a heartbeat. Emily's vision blurred, and her knees buckled as a wave of memories crashed over her. She was back in the cabin, but it wasn't the same. It was dark and cold, the windows boarded up. Her parents were arguing, their voices loud and angry. Why did you bring it here? Her father shouted, his face red with anger. I didn't know, her mother cried, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what it would do. Emily watched, frozen in horror, as her father grabbed the red ornament and threw it against the wall. The glass shattered and a dark, shadowy figure emerged from the shards. It was the creature. The memory faded, and Emily was back in the withered cabin, the red ornament still glowing faintly on the tree. You brought it here, the man said, his voice cold. You unleashed it. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. The man stepped closer, his hollow eyes boring into hers. And now you must finish what you started. Emily collapsed to her knees, her hands trembling as the weight of the memories bore down on her. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, and the icy air around her felt like it was slicing through her skin. The man stood in the shadow of the tree, watching her with an expression that was equal parts amusement and malice. You still don't understand, do you? He said, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. Emily looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she choked out. I didn't know what it was. I was just a child. The man's smile widened, his teeth gleaming like shards of ice. Intentions don't erase consequences, he said. What you unleashed that night has been growing ever since. Feeding. Spreading. He gestured to the tree, its blackened branches twisting unnaturally as if reacting to his words. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about everyone it's touched. Every life it's consumed. Emily's gaze shifted to the blood-red ornament hanging from the tree. It pulsed faintly, its glow growing stronger with every passing moment. What do you mean? What does it want? The man's smile faded, replaced by a grim expression. It wants everything. And if you don't stop it, that's exactly what it will take. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry and raw. How? How do I stop it? The man stepped closer, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. You already have the answer, he said. It's been with you all along. Emily's brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? Instead of answering, the man extended his hand, palm up. Slowly, something began to materialize in his grasp. It was an ornament, identical to the one she had been holding before it shattered. Its surface was smooth and black, its glow faint and ominous. Take it, the man said, his voice low and commanding. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, to fight, to do anything but take the object from his hand. But as she stared at it, something deep inside her stirred, a faint, flickering memory she couldn't quite grasp. Against her better judgment, she reached out and took the ornament. The moment her fingers touched its surface, a surge of energy shot through her body, making her gasp. Images flooded her mind, fragmented and chaotic, but unmistakably real. She saw herself as a child, standing in front of the Christmas tree in the cabin. She was holding the blood-red ornament, her face lit with curiosity and wonder. Her parents were arguing in the background, their voices distant and muffled. Then she saw the moment it happened. She had dropped the ornament, its fragile surface shattering against the floor. The shadowy figure had emerged from the shards, its glowing eyes locking onto her as it stretched and twisted into its full, monstrous form. Her parents had tried to protect her, but it was too late. The creature had already taken hold, its influence spreading through the house like a dark tide. Emily's chest tightened as the memory faded, leaving her trembling and breathless. I broke it, she whispered, the realization crashing over her like a tidal wave. I let it out. Yes, the man said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "And now you must put it back." Emily stared at the black ornament in her hand, its faint glow pulsing in time with her heartbeat. "How?" The man gestured to the blood-red ornament on the tree. "They are two halves of the same whole. To contain it, you must reunite them." Emily's eyes widened. "And what happens if I do?" The man's gaze darkened. "You'll find out soon enough." The ground beneath them began to tremble, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the air. Emily spun around, her heart pounding as she saw the shadows in the room begin to move. The creature was here. Its form was more defined now, its body a mass of writhing darkness and sharp, jagged edges. Its glowing eyes pierced through the gloom, locking onto Emily with a predatory intensity. She stumbled backward, clutching the black ornament tightly. The creature let out a deafening roar, its twisted limbs stretching toward her like claws. "Do it now!" the man shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Emily's mind raced as she turned back to the tree. The blood-red ornament glowed brighter, its light pulsing in time with the creature's movements. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she lifted the black ornament toward its counterpart. The creature roared again, its movements growing more frantic as if it could sense what she was about to do. The moment the two ornaments touched, the room exploded with light. Emily was thrown backward, her body hitting the ground hard. The light was blinding, filling every corner of the space and erasing the shadows. The creature let out a final ear-splitting scream before it dissolved into the brightness, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. When the light faded, the room was silent. The tree was gone, and so was the pedestal. The only thing left was the blood-red ornament, now whole and unbroken, sitting in the snow. Emily sat up slowly, her body aching and her mind spinning. She reached out and picked up the ornament, its surface cool and smooth beneath her fingers. The man was gone too, leaving her alone in the empty forest. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air was still. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on her chest had lifted. But as Emily stared at the ornament in her hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. Emily's heart thudded in her chest as she stood alone in the snow, staring down at the blood-red ornament. The weight of it in her hands felt different now, heavier somehow, as if it carried the secrets of everything that had happened up until this point. The forest around her was eerily silent, the only sound the faint crunch of snow beneath her feet. The air, once thick with the pressure of something unnatural, now felt unnervingly calm, as though the very essence of the place had shifted. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. She turned around, scanning the empty space around her, but saw nothing. No shadows, no creatures lurking in the trees. Yet the tension in her gut remained, a gnawing fear that wouldn't let go. The memories, those broken, fragmented images of the past, swirled in her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. She had done it. She had reunited the two halves of the ornament. But the price had been steep. The creature was gone, yes, but what had truly been contained? And what was still out there waiting for her? Without warning, the ground beneath her feet shifted, as though the very earth had sighed in relief. Emily gasped and stumbled, almost losing her balance as the snow around her seemed to ripple. A deep, low rumble filled the air, vibrating through her bones. She froze, her pulse quickening. The tremor grew, shaking the trees and sending a flock of birds into the night sky. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Emily stood motionless, listening to the silence that followed, the remnants of the tremor still echoing in her ears. Her breath came out in shallow gasps, her mind racing. Had it been the end? Or had something else begun? The ornament in her hand flickered, its surface shifting between shades of crimson and black, as if it were alive. She felt a tug at her consciousness, a faint whisper at the edges of her thoughts. A memory, one she hadn't known existed, began to surface, one that felt too raw, too painful to bear. She saw herself as a child again, standing in front of the Christmas tree in the cabin. She saw the joy on her parents' faces, the warmth of the fire, the sweet smell of cinnamon and pine filling the room. It was a perfect Christmas night, one that she had believed she would never forget. But there, among the warmth and joy, something was wrong. A shadow lingered at the edge of her memory, something dark and uninvited. It was in the way her father had looked at her that night, strangely distant, as if he were seeing her for the first time. It was in the way her mother had clutched the ornament tightly, her fingers trembling just before she handed it to Emily. That wasn't a normal ornament. The realization hit Emily like a wave crashing against the shore. The ornament wasn't just a decoration. It was a prison. A prison that had been holding something inside it for far longer than she had realized. She had never known the true power it held, the way it had called to her, the way it had found its way into her hands that night. Her parents had tried to warn her, but they had been too late. The creature had already begun to rise, and she was the one who had released it. But that wasn't all. The memory twisted, showing her a flash of the creature, no longer a shadow but a figure. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, its jagged limbs stretching toward her parents. Emily saw the terror on their faces as they tried to fight it back, but their efforts were futile. The creature was too strong, too powerful. And then, the moment before everything went black, before Emily had been cast into this cursed place, she saw it again. The figure standing over her, its skeletal face twisted into a grin. It had been the man. Her heart skipped a beat. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. The man in the cabin, the one who had warned her, who had given her the ornament, it was no coincidence. He wasn't just a witness to what had happened. He had been there the whole time. The man was the creature. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the truth settled into her bones. The man hadn't been trying to help her. He had been guiding her, manipulating her. He had known all along what she would do, how she would reunite the ornaments, how she would unknowingly set everything in motion again. And now, with the creature gone, she was left holding the final piece of the puzzle. The ornament was still glowing, pulsing in her hand as though it were waiting for something. Waiting for her. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The forest around her remained still, the trees standing like silent sentinels. But then, just as she thought she was alone, she heard it, a soft whisper barely audible over the wind. Asterisk, "You can't escape." Asterisk. Emily's heart skipped a beat and she spun around, looking desperately for the source of the voice. But there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more insistent. Asterisk, "You can't run from what you've done." Asterisk. She clutched the ornament tighter, the pain in her chest growing. The whispers were everywhere now, circling around her, each one pulling her deeper into the darkness. The weight of the truth, the weight of her guilt, pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. But even as the whispers grew louder, there was something else. A sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. Emily spun around, her pulse racing, her hand tightening around the ornament. And there, standing just at the edge of the forest, was a figure. Was the man. His face was hidden in shadow, but she could see his eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, cold and unfeeling. His grin spread slowly, like a predator savoring its prey. "You thought it was over," he said, his voice low and mocking. "You thought you could put it all behind you." Emily's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. This wasn't over. It had never been over. The game was still in play and she was still its pawn. And the man? He was far more than she had ever imagined. The figure stood before Emily, his presence like a shadow stretching across her soul. The cold of the night seemed to deepen, a sudden chill that cut through her clothes and sank into her bones. Emily's pulse raced in her throat, but she refused to look away. She had come this far, she wouldn't be controlled by fear again. The man, the thing standing before her, was smiling now, a slow, knowing curve of his lips. His eyes, glowing faintly like two distant embers, never wavered from hers. There was no question, he knew what she was thinking. And that terrified her more than anything else. "You thought you could just put it back together," he said, his voice so smooth it was almost like a caress, "but you can't undo what's been done. You can't run from what you've awoken." Emily clenched her fists around the ornament, feeling its pulse beneath her fingers, its glow flickering. "Why?" she managed to choke out. "Why did you let this happen? Why make me do this?" The man's grin widened. There was something predatory in his smile, something ancient and cruel. "Because you were always meant to." Her stomach twisted. "Meant to?" she echoed. "What does that mean? What does this have to do with me?" His gaze darkened, the intensity of it burning into her skin. "You think this is just about the ornament? About the creature?" "No, Emily, this is about you." She stepped back, her legs shaking, her mind racing. Every part of her screamed that she needed to run, but she stood frozen. "You've been chosen," he continued, his voice now a whisper that seemed to reach into her very thoughts. "You were born into this. Every step you've taken, every choice you've made has led you here. And you can't escape it? Emily shook her head in disbelief. No, I was just a child. I didn't know what I was doing. His laugh was low, almost sympathetic. That's the thing. You never knew. You never realized what you were born into. But it's in your blood, Emily. The power. The connection. The darkness. His words cut through her like a blade. Her knees buckled and she sank into the snow, the weight of his words crashing over her. This couldn't be real. She couldn't be the one responsible for all of this. She wasn't. A sharp, cold hand grabbed her wrist, yanking her upright. She gasped in shock as the man's grip tightened, pulling her toward him with unnatural strength. His face was inches from hers now, his eyes burning with a predatory hunger. You think you have no part in this? He growled. That it's all just some mistake? You're the one who set this in motion, Emily. You broke the seal. You released the power. And now it's yours to control. Control? Emily could barely breathe. The thought of being in control of anything was laughable. She couldn't even control herself. She couldn't even make sense of the nightmare she had stumbled into. Let go of me, she screamed, her voice hoarse. She tried to jerk away, but his grip was like iron. You're not getting away, he whispered. Not this time. It's all too late. You've made your choice. The ornament in her hand began to glow brighter, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She could feel it, an electric hum coursing through her veins, filling her mind with flashes of memories that weren't her own. She saw glimpses of dark, ancient rituals, of hands reaching out from the shadows, pulling her into a place she didn't want to be. The man's face twisted, his lips curling into a grin. It's awake now, Emily. It's been awakened by you, and it will not be denied. Her mind was spiraling. The world around her seemed to blur, spinning faster and faster until she couldn't tell where the earth ended and the sky began. The voices, the whispers, the fragments of memories, they all collided in a painful cacophony that was too much to bear. No, she screamed again, more desperate this time, her body trembling. I won't let it control me. I won't. But the man's laughter only grew louder, echoing in her ears like a chant. You don't have a choice. It's already inside you. She tried to pull away to break free from his grip, but it was no use. The force of the connection, the weight of the power, was too much. Her knees buckled again and she fell forward, her hands trembling as they pressed against the snow. And then, in the space between breaths, something shifted. A voice, a different voice, whispered in her ear. This one wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was warm, almost comforting. Emily? She froze. It wasn't the man's voice. She slowly lifted her head, the glow of the ornament still pulsing faintly in her hand. Emily, you don't have to do this. You can stop it. The voice was soft, almost a plea. Her heart thudded in her chest. Who are you? She whispered, looking around frantically. The man's grip tightened, his laughter now a low growl. You think someone else is going to save you? But the voice was insistent, growing clearer. Emily, listen to me. You can stop it. You're stronger than you know. Stop it? Emily repeated, her thoughts a jumble of confusion and fear. How can I stop this? The man sneered. You can't. You're already part of it. You always have been. But the voice, the new voice, continued. Remember who you are. You are more than what they've made you believe. You can break free from this. Emily's breath caught. The words were like a spark in the dark, a glimmer of light in the suffocating gloom. She clutched the ornament tighter, trying to focus on the voice, trying to block out the man's mocking tone. Who are you? She demanded again, her voice shaking. I'm a part of you, the voice replied gently. You've always known this deep down. The power has always been yours. You just need to believe it. She felt something stir inside her, a familiar warmth, something that had been buried deep within her, hidden for so long. The sensation of something awakening, not in the ornament, but in herself. The man stepped back, his eyes narrowing in confusion. What's happening? What are you? But Emily didn't answer. Instead, she focused on the warmth inside her, letting it grow, letting it fill her from the inside out. She could feel the power, her power, growing, pushing back against the dark influence. The man's eyes widened, his lips pulling back in a snarl. No, you don't control this. I do. No, Emily whispered, her voice steady now. Not anymore. The ornament in her hand began to glow brighter, the light blinding as the force inside her surged forward. The man recoiled, his face twisted in horror as the light swallowed him whole. And then, nothing. The forest was silent again. Emily stood in the snow, her breath visible in the cold night air. The power was still there, thrumming beneath her skin, but it felt different now. It felt like a part of her, not something that could control her, but something she could control. And for the first time since all of this began, she felt like she had a choice. The silence that followed the explosion of light felt unnatural, like the world itself had held its breath and forgotten how to exhale. The snow beneath Emily's boots remained eerily still, untouched by the chaos that had just unfolded. Her heartbeat thudded in her chest, a slow, heavy rhythm, but as her eyes scanned the empty space around her, she didn't feel the fear that had previously gripped her. Instead, there was a strange calmness, a fleeting sense of control, of power. But she knew better than to trust it. Her fingers, still curled around the ornament, trembled slightly as she looked down at it. It no longer pulsed with the same dark, ominous energy it once had. Now it felt almost dormant. The warmth that had filled her earlier seemed to have retreated, leaving only a faint glow behind, like a distant star that no longer had the strength to shine brightly. For a moment, Emily stood there, alone in the snow, wondering if she had truly won. Had she finally rid herself of the curse? Or had she simply momentarily gained the upper hand, only to find herself standing at the precipice of something far worse? A flicker of movement caught her eye. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the darkness at the edge of the forest. The shape was too blurry to make out, but the shadow, it was long, unnaturally long, stretching out like a slithering thing. Her pulse quickened. No, it couldn't be. She had felt the power recede. She had broken free, hadn't she? But the shadow moved again, and this time, Emily's breath hitched. It was not the shape of a man. It was something else entirely, a shape that twisted, contorted, like it was made of shadows and smoke, its edges constantly shifting. The ornament in her hand grew warmer. Her heart raced as she turned on her heel, taking a step backward, then another and another, her feet crunching in the snow. She could feel the darkness encroaching from the corners of her vision, tugging at her consciousness, demanding her attention. And yet, her mind refused to accept it. "I'm done," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. "This can't be happening." But as the shadows grew thicker, as the whispers from the forest grew louder, Emily knew deep down that the nightmare was far from over. There was something in the air now, something heavy, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. It was as though the entire forest was alive with an energy that she could neither comprehend nor fight. The trees, once so still, now seemed to move with a life of their own, their branches creaking and swaying as if beckoning her forward. No, she couldn't go any further. She couldn't let it pull her back in. With a desperate cry, Emily turned and ran, her boots sliding on the slick snow as she sped through the trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The darkness chased her, the whispers growing louder, angrier. The snow beneath her feet was thick and treacherous, and her body ached with every step she took, but she didn't stop. The adrenaline pumping through her veins drowned out everything else. The pain, the exhaustion, the fear. She had to escape. She had to get away from whatever was hunting her. But even as she ran, a question clawed at the back of her mind. Where could she go? The forest had closed in on her from every direction. There was no escape from the nightmare. The wind howled, the trees groaning in response, as if they were alive and aware of her presence. Emily's breath came out in quick bursts, her lungs burning, but she forced herself to keep moving. Her feet were numb now, and her fingers had gone stiff around the ornament, but she couldn't let go. Not yet. As she pushed forward, her foot snagged on something buried beneath the snow. She stumbled and fell, the coldness of the ground shocking against her skin. The ornament slipped from her hand, tumbling into the snow, its faint glow fading for a moment. "Damn it," Emily muttered, reaching out for it, but the moment her fingers brushed against the ornament's surface, the world seemed to tilt. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell backward, her vision blurring as the shadows swarmed around her, the whispers filling her ears. And then the voice. "Emily, it's time." She shot upright, gasping for air, her eyes wide in panic, but the shadows were gone. The snow had stopped falling. The whispers had stopped. Everything was still. She blinked, her heart racing. The forest around her was quiet. No longer threatening. No longer dark. Time, she whispered, her voice hoarse. She reached for the ornament, but this time, when she held it in her hands, it no longer felt as if it held a terrible power. It was just a piece of glass, smooth and cold. Nothing more. But the voice hadn't been a trick of her mind. She knew it. She felt it in her bones. Emily, the time is now. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice wasn't from the forest. It wasn't from the shadows. It wasn't the man. It was from inside her. Suddenly, the trees around her shifted again, but this time they weren't moving in the way they had before. They parted, revealing a narrow path that led deep into the heart of the forest. The darkness from before was gone, but in its place was something far worse. The path was lined with ancient stones, some cracked, some covered in thick moss. But what caught her attention were the symbols carved into each one. Symbols that looked eerily familiar. She had seen them before. On the ornament. Her breath caught in her chest as the realization hit her. This was it. The final step. She had to go down that path. There was no other choice. She didn't know why, but she felt the pull. The voice was right, she could feel it now, the urgency, the weight of what was coming. If she turned back, she knew the shadows would follow her. She had no choice. With a steadying breath, Emily took a step forward. And then another. Her feet moved almost on their own, as though they knew the way. The path seemed to beckon her, its eerie glow casting long shadows on the stones beneath her feet. The forest around her was silent, but the air felt charged with energy, as if something were stirring beneath the earth itself. She wasn't sure what she was walking toward. She didn't know what she was about to face. But she had already come too far to turn back now. With each step, the whispers grew louder, like a chant in the distance, pulling her forward, urging her to continue. Emily couldn't tell if the path would lead to salvation or destruction. But she knew this much: whatever was ahead, she was not alone. The path seemed to stretch endlessly before Emily, twisting and turning as it led her deeper into the heart of the forest. The air around her grew heavy with a strange energy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something darker, more ancient. The trees were tall and oppressive, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers as if trying to pull her in. Emily's pulse quickened with every step, but she couldn't stop. The voice, the one that had been guiding her, was more insistent now, urging her forward, coaxing her to continue on. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a pull, a magnetic force that she couldn't resist. She tried to ignore it. She tried to focus on the path ahead, but the symbols etched into the stones at her feet seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, and the deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. The shadows that had once been her enemies were now her only companions, stretching out from the trees like dark tendrils that reached for her with every step. It felt as though the forest itself was watching her. The whispers were louder now, too, no longer vague murmurs in the distance. They were coming from all around her, filling her ears with words she couldn't quite understand. The language was ancient, primal, something that tugged at the edge of her memory, something that seemed so familiar and yet so far out of reach. Her mind raced, trying to grasp at the meaning, but every time she thought she understood, the words slipped away, dissolving into the thick fog that hung in the air. "What do you want from me?" she whispered into the night, her voice trembling, her throat dry with fear. The only answer she received was the sound of her own footsteps echoing through the trees. And then, suddenly she stopped. There, ahead of her, was a clearing. It was stark against the rest of the forest, a vast, open space where the trees seemed to recede just enough to let the moonlight spill through the canopy. The ground in the clearing was bare, covered in patches of dead grass and cracked earth. But at the center there was something else. A stone circle. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The symbols, they were everywhere. The stones that surrounded the circle were large, worn by time, but unmistakably familiar. They were the same ones that had lined the path. Each one was carved with intricate symbols, and as she drew closer, she could feel their power pulsing in the air. The energy was thick here, almost suffocating. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped closer to the center of the circle. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, as though the earth itself was alive, vibrating with the ancient power that had been sealed away for centuries. The whispers were louder now. They weren't just in her ears, they were in her mind, in her thoughts, pushing, pressing, demanding attention. "Emily," the voice called, clear and unmistakable now. "It's time. You've come far enough." Her body froze, the words sinking into her bones. She knew without a doubt that she had reached the point of no return. The moment she stepped into the circle, there would be no turning back. But something deep inside her, some primal part of her being, knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment she had been chosen for. "I don't want to do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing crescendo of whispers. "You don't have to want to," the voice answered, its tone strangely soothing, like the sound of a lullaby sung in a language that was both familiar and foreign. "You're not in control of this anymore. It's always been this way. You've always been meant for this." The air around her seemed to thrum with energy, each pulse vibrating through her chest. She could feel the power deep within her, the strange warmth that had been growing ever since she first touched the ornament. Emily knew it wasn't just the artifact that had called her here. It wasn't just the whispers in the forest. No, this was bigger than that. This was about her. She had been chosen. Her fingers brushed against the cold surface of one of the stones. The instant she made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through her, making her body tense. The symbols on the stones flared to life, glowing with an eerie, greenish light. The ground beneath her feet shook as if something beneath was awakening. The whispers became more urgent, louder, demanding. And then the ground in the center of the circle cracked open. At first it was just a small fissure, but it quickly widened, sending tremors through the air. A dark, swirling mist poured from the crack, and a figure began to emerge from the shadows. Emily gasped, stumbling backward, her mind reeling as the figure began to take shape. It was him. The man from the forest, the one who had led her here. The one who had been watching her every step of the way. His eyes glowed with the same faint ember-like light, but now his face was clearer, more distinct. He was tall, with sharp, angular features and a look of pure arrogance, as though he knew something she didn't. "You've come," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "And now it begins." Emily's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, unable to tear her gaze away from him. "I've been waiting for you," he continued, his smile widening. "For so long I've waited. You were the one who broke the seal, the one who awakened the power. And now it's time to finish what you started." The ground continued to tremble as the mist swirled around the circle, thickening, closing in on her. She could hear the whispers growing louder, faster, almost frantic now. They were all around her, inside her, pulling her toward something. But what? She didn't understand. Her legs felt weak, and her body trembled as the figure's shadow seemed to stretch across the circle, enveloping her in darkness. She could feel the weight of it pressing in on her, suffocating her, choking her with the unbearable pressure of what was to come. And then everything went still. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. But then the voice returned. The soft, comforting voice that had been guiding her through the darkness. "Emily, you have to choose. You have the power now. You can stop it. You can stop him." She closed her eyes, the weight of the decision crashing down on her. Could she really stop this? Could she undo everything she had set in motion? The figure's laugh echoed through the clearing, and Emily knew deep down that whatever happened next would change everything. The silence in the clearing was suffocating. Emily's chest constricted with fear, her breath shallow, her heart hammering so violently it almost drowned out the whispering voice in her mind. She could feel the presence of the man, no, the thing before her. His shadow loomed, oppressive and dark, the mist swirling around his feet like some kind of dark ritual in motion. The air seemed to hold its breath. The entire forest, once so full of life and motion, felt like it was waiting, poised for something she couldn't understand, something she feared was beyond her control. "Choose," the voice in her head urged again, its tone gentle but insistent. "You hold the power now, Emily. You have the strength to break free." But how could she? She was so small, so insignificant compared to the force of the dark figure standing before her. She had no idea what this power was, how it worked, or if she could even use it to protect herself. The man, if he could be called that, stepped closer, his footfalls slow and deliberate. Each step echoed like the sound of a drumbeat in her chest. "You've made it this far, Emily," he said, his voice low and rich with malice. "But you think you can stop me? You think you can control what you've unleashed?" His laugh was dark, filled with centuries of contempt. "You are nothing but a pawn in a game far older than you can comprehend." Emily's stomach twisted. The power, whatever it was pulsing through her, a dark, irresistible force. She could feel it inside her chest, in her blood, in her very soul. It wasn't just the ornament. It wasn't just the trees, the whispers, or the man standing before her. It was everything. Everything she had ever known, everything she had ever feared was part of this. And in that moment she understood. The forest, the darkness, the ancient symbols, none of it was by chance. She had been chosen. She had been brought here for this moment. The man continued to approach, his eyes gleaming with a fire that seemed to burn through the mist. You were always meant to serve this darkness, Emily. You don't have the strength to resist. None of you ever do. His words were sharp and they cut through her like a blade. Doubt crept into her mind. What if he was right? What if she couldn't stop this? What if she had already lost? But even as the fear threatened to swallow her whole, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She wasn't just a pawn. She wasn't just another soul to be consumed by the darkness. The voice in her head returned, louder now, urging her on. You can break free. You can control the power. Remember who you are, Emily. You are not alone. Her fingers tightened around the ornament, and for the first time she felt a strange sense of connection to it. It wasn't just an object, it was a key to something much larger, something powerful enough to change the very fabric of reality itself. I am not a pawn, Emily whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that still clung to her like a shadow. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. And I won't let you win. The man's eyes narrowed as if surprised by her sudden defiance. You think you can stop me with will alone? He sneered. You have no idea what you're dealing with. With a swift motion, he raised his arm, and the ground beneath Emily's feet seemed to crack open, the earth shuddering in response to his power. The trees groaned, their branches twisting and reaching out toward her as if they were alive, straining to grab hold of her. But Emily didn't flinch. Her body shook with the force of the power she could feel swirling around her, but she didn't back down. The ornament, its dull glow, was beginning to grow brighter, its energy responding to her defiance. The symbols that had once seemed so alien to her were now becoming clearer, their meaning falling into place like pieces of a puzzle she had been slowly assembling. Stop, she whispered to herself, focusing every ounce of her being on the ornament. She could feel it. She could feel the power inside it, the connection between her and the ancient force that was pulling at her. For a moment, everything stood still. The mist paused, the shadows stopped moving, the trees seemed to hold their breath. And then, in an instant, Emily's mind was flooded with images. Ancient ruins, burning skies, people crying out in terror. But there was something else, something different. A dark figure standing alone at the center of it all, surrounded by destruction. Her heart raced as she understood. The figure, the dark man who had led her here, was not just a part of this story. He was the story. He was the force that had been feeding on the power of the forest, the power of the ornament, the power of everything Emily had unknowingly awakened. It had always been him. But the power she felt inside her was not just a tool to be controlled by him. It was hers. She could feel it now. The power was part of her strength, her will, her choice. She didn't have to fight this. She didn't have to resist it. She could use it. The darkness swirled around her, trying to suffocate her, trying to pull her back into the shadows. But she fought it. She reached inside herself, drawing on the power she had just begun to understand. And then, as the man raised his arms again, preparing to strike, Emily did the only thing she could do. She released it. A wave of energy erupted from her, a blinding force that swept through the clearing, through the trees, through the earth itself. The power crashed against the man, sending him stumbling back, his eyes wide with disbelief. The shadow that had surrounded him seemed to flicker, as if it were being torn apart by the force of the energy Emily had unleashed. No, he screamed, his voice filled with rage. You don't know what you've done. But Emily wasn't listening. The power was hers now. She could feel it coursing through her veins, like fire and ice, like the very heartbeat of the earth itself. She wasn't afraid anymore. The man's form began to shift, flickering between shadows, becoming something unrecognizable, something that wasn't quite human anymore. But it didn't matter. Emily's focus was unbroken. The energy continued to pulse from her, pushing him back, forcing him to retreat, to fade into the shadows from which he had come. And then, with a final, thunderous crack, he was gone. The clearing fell silent again, the air still and calm. The mist began to fade, the oppressive weight lifting from her shoulders. But Emily knew this was only the beginning. The forest was still alive with power. The symbols on the stones still glowed faintly, their energy alive and waiting. The darkness had been pushed back, but it had not been defeated. And Emily, standing alone in the clearing, finally realized the truth. She wasn't just the chosen one. She was its keeper. The silence after the storm was unnerving. Emily stood alone in the clearing, her chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. The earth beneath her feet seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm, almost as if it were trying to reclaim the peace it had lost. Yet, despite the stillness, she could feel something pulsing in the air around her. The energy from the stones, from the very earth itself, lingered like a heavy fog, thick and laden with meaning. Her heart still raced from the encounter. The darkness, she had faced it, pushed it back, but now she wasn't so sure it was truly gone. The remnants of the shadow still clung to the edges of her mind, whispering, taunting, threatening to return. "Is it over?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. The question echoed in the emptiness of the forest, but no answer came. She looked around the clearing, half expecting the figure to appear again, to rise from the ground like a nightmare that wouldn't end. But there was nothing. Just the faint glow of the stones and the faint rustling of the trees in the distance. She had done it. She had stopped him, for now. But Emily knew this wasn't a victory. It was a temporary reprieve. The forest, the power within it, had been disturbed. The curse wasn't just something that could be shut away, locked in a box. It was alive, a force that existed on its own, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Her thoughts were interrupted by a strange, unnatural crackling sound. It wasn't the rustle of the trees, nor the wind playing with the leaves. No, this was something else, something more deliberate. She turned her head sharply, her senses on high alert. From the edge of the clearing, a new presence seemed to emerge. It wasn't a figure this time. It was a sound, a low hum, like the faintest whisper of something ancient stirring beneath the surface. Emily's blood ran cold as she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her fingers gripped the ornament again, her body instinctively moving toward it, as if seeking its power for reassurance. The hum grew louder, sharper, vibrating in her bones. She forced herself to look toward the source of the sound, her eyes narrowing. The mist, which had once surrounded the clearing, was now coiling at the edge, drawn to something unseen. It was moving, swirling in on itself as if something was trying to break through. For a moment, she stood frozen, unable to move, paralyzed by the realization that the forest was not done with her yet. The ground trembled slightly beneath her feet, as if the forest was alive, breathing, waiting. And then the ground split open once more. The earth groaned, splitting apart in jagged cracks that seemed to pulse with the same dark energy Emily had felt before. She stumbled backward, her pulse spiking, her mind racing for answers. What was happening? From the depths of the fissure, something began to rise. At first it was just a shadow, a dark wisp of smoke that swirled in the air, but it grew, taking shape, taking form. Emily's stomach twisted as she recognized what it was. The same figure, the same dark man. But now he wasn't human. He was something else, something darker. His body seemed to flicker and shift between solid and smoke, an apparition in the true sense of the word. His eyes burned with an intensity that sent chills through her spine, but they were no longer filled with arrogance. Now they were filled with something else, rage. "You think you can control this?" His voice echoed, deep and mocking, as though the very air itself was vibrating with his words. "You've only unleashed a fraction of the power you've disturbed. You've been playing with forces you can't understand." Emily felt the weight of his words in the pit of her stomach, a crushing realization that what she had just witnessed was nothing compared to what she had set in motion. She had thought that by pushing him back, she had stopped it all. But now she knew the darkness was always going to return. And this time it wouldn't be as easy to fight. The figure's form solidified, becoming almost human in shape, but his features were twisted and unnatural. His skin, if it could be called skin, was cracked and scorched as though it had been burned from within. His hands were long and gnarled, his fingers curling like claws that reached out toward her. The air around him seemed to warp, crackling with energy, the very fabric of the forest bending and breaking under his presence. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She tried to step back, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, the energy around her locking her in place. She couldn't move. "You've awakened me, Emily," the figure hissed, his voice like a serpent's tongue. And now you will learn what happens when you disturb the balance. The mist surrounding the clearing began to swirl faster, swirling around her like a storm, the air thick with dark energy. She could feel the power building, crushing her from all sides, and for a moment she feared she was going to suffocate in it. But then something within her shifted. The ornament, her connection to the forest, to the power it held, flared with a bright, sharp light. Emily's fingers tightened around it, and she felt the pulse of the energy within her, within the stone, matching the figure's dark force. It was like a battle of wills, a tug of war between light and darkness, and she was the rope in the middle. "You think this will stop me?" the figure mocked, his voice a low growl. "You are nothing. You are weak, just like every other soul who's tried to control what should not be controlled." But Emily could feel it now. She wasn't weak. She wasn't powerless. The power inside her, inside the ornament, wasn't something to be afraid of. It was hers to command. It had been hers all along, and now, finally, she understood. She wasn't just a keeper. She was a protector. A guardian of this dark power, a force of balance that had been disturbed but not broken. With newfound determination, Emily focused every ounce of her being on the power she had just begun to understand. She called upon the energy within her, within the stones, and let it surge forward. The light from the ornament blazed so brightly that it seemed to rip through the darkness itself, scattering the mist, pushing the figure back, and lighting up the clearing with a searing, golden glow. The figure howled in agony, his form flickering as the light intensified. "No," he screamed, his voice filled with pure rage. "You cannot contain me. I am eternal." But Emily was done listening. She raised the ornament higher, her focus unwavering, her mind clear. She wasn't afraid anymore. "You're wrong," she said, her voice strong and sure. "I am the one in control now." And with that, the light exploded outward, consuming everything in its path. The explosion of light filled the clearing, blinding Emily for a moment. Her heart pounded so loud in her chest that she could barely hear the shrieks of rage coming from the dark figure. The light burned through the mist, shattering the oppressive fog that had wrapped itself around her like a vice. Her eyes were squeezed shut against the intensity, but she could feel it, the power surging through her, overwhelming the shadow that had tormented her. For a long moment the world was pure white. The earth beneath her feet seemed to disappear, and the trees, the stones, and the forest itself were swallowed by the blinding radiance. She had no sense of time, no sense of where she was, only the pulsing light and the presence of something immense. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the light began to fade. Emily's eyes slowly opened, but the world she saw was different. The forest, though still there, was no longer the place she had known. It was darker now, almost as if the very air was charged with something ancient and threatening. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled, their bark blackened in places, as if the force of the light had scorched them. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, jagged, the very earth shivering in the aftermath of the battle that had just occurred. The dark figure was gone, but the forest, it was not the same. Emily could feel it, feel the change in the air, in the earth, in everything around her. It was as though something had been permanently shifted, as though the very fabric of this place had been torn and remade. She took a shaky step forward, her fingers still gripping the ornament tightly. The stone in her hand was warm now, not hot like it had been when the battle had raged, but steady, almost comforting in its energy. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to press down on her from every direction. A faint whisper floated through the air, so faint at first that she wasn't sure she had heard it at all. But then louder, clearer it came again. "Emily?" Her heart skipped a beat. The voice. It was familiar, but it wasn't the voice of the man, of the dark figure she had just fought. This voice was softer, gentler. And yet it carried an unsettling edge. "Emily, can you hear me?" She froze. The whisper had come from within the forest, from deeper within the mist. The voice had been calling to her, inviting her, beckoning her toward something. Emily's chest tightened. She couldn't explain why, but she knew instinctively that this was something important. This was a new force, a new presence in the forest that had been awakened by the battle. Despite every instinct telling her to turn and leave, Emily felt herself drawn forward. The mist swirled around her, the air thick with anticipation. The forest itself seemed to be alive, breathing in time with her own hurried breaths. She walked forward, cautiously at first, each step taking her deeper into the unknown. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches creaking as though they were watching her, judging her every movement. The path ahead of her seemed endless, the shadows growing longer, deeper. "Emily?" The voice called again. This time it was closer, much closer. Her pulse quickened. There was something behind her. Something she couldn't see but could feel. A presence, waiting, watching. She spun around, expecting to see something lurking in the dark, but there was nothing there. The forest was still. It was too still. And then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She whirled around again, her breath catching in her throat. But once more there was nothing. The clearing behind her was as empty as it had been when she had first entered. Her mind was racing. What was going on? What was this presence that seemed to be lingering in the shadows? Was it another part of the darkness? Had she truly pushed everything back, or had she merely opened the door to something far worse? Before she could take another step, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead of her. Her breath hitched in her throat as she recognized the face. It was him, the dark man. But this time he wasn't twisted or corrupted. He wasn't the monstrous creature she had battled earlier. He was human, at least he appeared to be. His features were sharp, his eyes piercing and cold, but they lacked the malice that had once filled them. His clothes were elegant, almost regal, made of dark fabric that shimmered faintly in the dim light. He was still the same man, but something about him had changed. "Emily?" His voice was low, almost soothing. But there was an edge to it, something that made her heart race. "You've done well. You've learned much." She felt a chill race down her spine. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" The man took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been watching you, Emily. I've seen the power within you, the potential you've unlocked. You're different now. The battle you fought, it wasn't just with me. It was with something much greater." Emily's mind was spinning. "What do you mean? You're telling me there's more? I thought I stopped it. I thought I ended it." The man's smile was almost sympathetic. "No, Emily. You've only begun. The darkness you faced, yes, it's been pushed back for now. But it's not gone. It's always there, lurking, waiting. And the power you wield? It's both a gift and a curse. You've opened a door. And now you must learn to control what lies on the other side." The words hit her like a slap. She had known there was more to this. She had known it wouldn't be as simple as defeating the figure and walking away. But hearing the truth from this man's lips was enough to shake her to the core. The power she had felt, the power she had wielded, it wasn't just some force she could control at will. It was tied to something ancient, something far darker than she could comprehend. "I don't understand," Emily whispered. "What do I do now?" The man's expression softened, but there was no comfort in it. "Now, Emily, you must choose. The power you've awakened, it has a price. And you can't undo what's been done. But you can control it if you're strong enough." Emily's mind was reeling. She had been fighting for survival, fighting to protect herself from the darkness that had consumed the forest. But now it seemed like survival was only the beginning. There was so much more at stake. She had unlocked something dangerous, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face the consequences of that decision. Before she could voice her doubts, the man turned, his silhouette blending into the mist once more. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But until then, you'll have to decide how far you're willing to go." And with that he was gone. Emily stood alone in the clearing, her thoughts spinning. She had always thought that once she defeated the darkness, it would be over. But now she knew. It had only just begun. Emily stood in the clearing, her mind racing, her thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and fear. The air felt heavy now, more oppressive than it had ever been, and the mist continued to swirl around her, never quite lifting. The man, the dark figure who had been both her enemy and a strange guide, had vanished into the fog, leaving behind nothing but the lingering echo of his words. "You'll understand soon enough." She couldn't shake the weight of his words. They hung in the air like a thick fog, choking the very breath from her lungs. What did he mean? What had she done? She had thought that by wielding the ornament, by pushing back the darkness, she had won. She had believed that she could finally escape the nightmare of this cursed forest. But now, standing alone amidst the twisted trees and the eerie mist, Emily realized the truth. She had only just stepped into the storm. Her fingers tightened around the ornament, its smooth surface reassuring against her palm, but it no longer felt like the powerful tool it once had. It felt like a ticking clock, a constant reminder that she had no control over the forces at play. The power was growing, pulsing with an intensity she couldn't begin to understand. It was as if it was waiting for something, or someone, to claim it fully. The ground beneath her feet trembled again. This time she didn't have to look to know what was coming. The earth groaned, splitting in jagged lines as the mist began to coil tighter, pulling the shadows inward. She could feel the familiar coldness creeping back, a shiver crawling up her spine as the darkness grew. "Emily?" The voice whispered, now more urgent, more desperate. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The trees seemed to sway in time with the sound, their branches reaching out like long skeletal arms. She spun around, scanning the clearing, but there was nothing. The voice wasn't coming from a figure. This time it was coming from within her. It was inside her head, in the pit of her stomach, pulling at her heartstrings. It was a voice she could no longer ignore, a voice that called her, compelled her. She clutched the ornament harder, feeling the warmth radiate from it, almost as though it was trying to comfort her. The voice continued, growing stronger with each passing moment. "Come closer, Emily. Come and see what you've set in motion." She wanted to run. She wanted to flee from the terrible force closing in around her. But her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the very earth was holding her in place, binding her to this cursed land. She could feel the eyes of the forest upon her, could almost hear the whispers of every tree, every stone, every shadow, urging her to step forward. "Don't be afraid," the voice cooed, a strange calmness in its tone. "You've already crossed the line. It's too late to turn back now." The trees parted in front of her, revealing a path that hadn't been there before. A faint light glowed at the end of it, soft and golden, like a beacon in the darkness. Despite every warning her instincts screamed at her, Emily took a step forward, compelled by the voice, drawn to the light. She didn't know why, but she knew she had to follow. There was no other choice. The path was narrow, the ground uneven, but she kept walking, her heart thundering in her chest. With every step, the fog thickened, the air grew colder, and the light grew brighter, more blinding. It wasn't just a light anymore, it was a force, something ancient and powerful, pulling at her like a magnet. Then, at the end of the path, she saw it. A stone circle. It was exactly like the one she had encountered earlier, only this one was far larger, far older. The stones were covered in strange symbols, symbols she recognized from the dream she had had before all of this had started. Symbols that had seemed so meaningless at the time, but now, in the dim light, they pulsed with a dark energy she couldn't ignore. As she stepped into the circle, the ground beneath her feet hummed with power. The air crackled, the very earth vibrating as though it were alive. And at the center of the circle, there it was, a massive stone glowing with a faint, sickly green light. It was the heart of the forest, the source of the curse. The moment Emily set foot within the stone circle, everything changed. The ground trembled violently, the earth splitting and shifting beneath her. The trees around her began to warp, twisting into grotesque shapes, their limbs reaching out as though trying to trap her in their grip. The mist thickened, enveloping her completely, suffocating her with its oppressive presence. And then the voice that had been calling her, spoke again, but this time, it was no longer gentle. It was sharp, full of hunger, full of need. "You've come far, Emily," it said. "But you still don't understand, do you?" Emily felt her knees weaken, her body trembling with exhaustion, with fear. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the heavy, oppressive air. The voice chuckled, low, mocking. "It's not what I want from you. It's what you need from me." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. The stone at the center of the circle began to glow brighter, its eerie light filling the space with a sickly green hue. The symbols carved into the stone pulsed, their dark energy thrumming through the air. Emily's head spun, her thoughts crashing into each other, a cacophony of confusion and terror. "You've already chosen, Emily," the voice whispered again, this time directly in her ear. She spun around, but no one was there. "You unlocked it, and now you must embrace it." The stone seemed to pulse with life, its energy growing stronger, darker. And Emily realized in that moment that she was no longer a passive observer. She had been a part of this from the very beginning. The curse had never been something outside of her. It had always been inside her. It had always been a part of her. And now it was time to face what she had set into motion. The power surged within her, stronger than ever before, pulling at her, consuming her. She could feel the darkness trying to overtake her, drowning her, twisting her thoughts, her will. Her hands shook as she reached for the stone, drawn to it with an irresistible force. The moment her fingers touched its cold surface, everything went black. The forest went silent. Story 3. It was supposed to be just another quiet Christmas Eve. Hot cocoa on the stove, the glow of the fireplace dancing on the walls. But when Emily heard the faint knock at the window, she knew something was terribly wrong. Who, or what, could be out there on a night like this in a storm so vicious it swallowed every sound? What she saw when she pulled back the curtain would haunt her for the rest of her life. The snowstorm had arrived earlier than anyone expected, blanketing the forest in an oppressive silence. Emily's small cabin, miles from the nearest neighbor, felt even more isolated under the weight of the storm. The wind howled like a restless spirit, battering the shutters and piling snow against the door. Inside, the glow of the fireplace cast flickering shadows on the walls, a fragile warmth against the bitter cold outside. Emily had planned for a quiet evening. She wasn't in the mood for festive cheer, not this year, not after everything. The grief of losing her sister still clung to her like a second skin, and the thought of celebrating Christmas without her felt hollow. Instead, she had resolved to spend the night alone, curled up with a blanket and a mug of cocoa, watching the storm rage from the safety of her home. She was stirring her cocoa when the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual for the power to act up during a storm, especially this far out in the woods, but something about the way the light dimmed unsettled her. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the room, twisting into shapes that seemed to move on their own. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the lights went out completely. Darkness swallowed the cabin. Emily set down her mug and reached for her phone. The screen illuminated her face in a pale glow, but when she tried to check the time, the phone froze. The image of her and her sister, the same photo she had been avoiding all month, stared back at her. It was from a Christmas long ago, both of them laughing in matching sweaters. She tried to close the photo, but the screen wouldn't respond. The phone died in her hands. That was when she heard it. Knock. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible over the howling wind. Emily froze, her ears straining to catch it again. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm. Then it came again. Knock. Knock. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect at a door. It was sharper, more deliberate, as if someone, or something, was tapping directly on the glass. The kitchen window. Emily's chest tightened. She lived alone, far from any main roads. Nobody should be out here, not in this storm, not on Christmas Eve. Gripping the edge of the counter, she willed herself to move, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but the thought of what might be on the other side made her stomach churn. She reached for the nearest thing she could use as a weapon, a heavy cast-iron skillet, and took a cautious step forward. The wind rattled the glass as she hesitated in front of the curtain. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the fabric, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a branch blown loose by the storm. Maybe it was just her imagination. Or maybe it wasn't. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Emily yanked the curtain aside. The window was empty. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale, framed by the swirling snow outside. She exhaled a shaky breath, laughing nervously at herself. Of course there was nothing there. She was letting her imagination run wild. But just as she started to pull the curtain closed, she saw it. A shadow moved in the storm. It was fleeting, barely more than a blur against the white expanse, but it was enough to send her heart racing. She dropped the curtain and stepped back, her mind screaming at her to lock the doors, to call for help, except there was no one to call. The knock came again. This time it wasn't at the window. It was at the front door. Emily's chest heaved as she backed away, clutching the skillet like a lifeline. The knock wasn't frantic or hurried. It was measured, almost polite. 3 firm raps against the wood, followed by silence. Her instincts told her not to answer. Whatever was out there wasn't looking for shelter. It was looking for her. But then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Emily? The voice was muffled, distorted by the storm, but it was unmistakable. It was her sister's voice. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible." Her sister was gone, had been gone for years. There was no way, and yet the voice called out again, more insistent this time. "Emily, it's so cold, let me in." Tears welled in her eyes as she stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She wanted to believe it was her sister, that somehow this was all a mistake, that the nightmare of the past 5 years had been a cruel illusion. But deep down she knew the truth. Whatever was at her door wasn't her sister. It knocked again, harder this time. The doorknob rattled and the sound jolted her out of her daze. She turned and ran to the living room, her heart pounding like a drum. The fire had died down, leaving the room shrouded in shadows. Emily crouched behind the couch, gripping the skillet so tightly her knuckles turned white. The knocking stopped. For a moment there was silence. Only the wind howled outside as if mocking her fear. She tried to steady her breathing, to convince herself that whatever was out there would go away. And then the window shattered. Glass rained down as the storm roared into the cabin. Emily screamed, scrambling to her feet, but her blood turned to ice when she saw what climbed through the broken window. It wasn't human. The figure was gaunt and twisted, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes burned like embers in its hollow face, locking onto Emily with a hunger that made her skin crawl. "Emily," it hissed, its voice a grotesque mockery of her sister's. She bolted for the door, her survival instincts kicking in. But as she fumbled with the lock, she realized the storm had grown impossibly loud, drowning out every thought, every sound except for the creature's raspy breaths behind her. "Let me in," it whispered, inches from her ear. Emily threw open the door and ran into the storm, the cold biting at her skin. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The snow swallowed her footsteps as she disappeared into the night, the creature's laughter echoing in the wind. The storm clawed at Emily like a feral beast, its icy tendrils cutting through her thin sweater and numbing her to the core. She could barely see more than a few feet ahead as the snow swirled in chaotic spirals, erasing the familiar landscape of the woods she had lived in for years. The cabin was behind her now, but the image of the shattered window and the creature crawling inside burned in her mind. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she stumbled over hidden roots and rocks, the frozen ground threatening to trip her at every step. Emily didn't know where she was running, she only knew she couldn't stop. The sound of the wind wasn't enough to mask the faint crunching of snow behind her. Something was following her. She dared a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. Through the flurry of snow, she could just make out a shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't in a hurry, but it didn't need to be. The way it moved, unnatural and jerky yet deliberate, was worse than a full sprint. It knew she couldn't escape. Panic surged through her veins. She couldn't let it catch her. She wouldn't. "Help!" She screamed into the storm, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. She knew it was pointless. There was no one out here. No one to hear her. But then, far ahead, she saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. A house? A campsite? Anything was better than staying out here with whatever was behind her. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning as she stumbled toward the light. As she drew closer, the light resolved into the warm glow of a lantern, swinging gently in the wind. It hung from a post beside an old wooden shed, the kind hunters or park rangers might use as a shelter. The shed was small and dilapidated, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow, but it was shelter. Emily didn't think twice. She threw herself against the door, her numb fingers fumbling with the latch. It gave way with a creak, and she practically fell inside, slamming the door shut behind her. The interior was dark and musty, the air heavy with the smell of damp wood and something metallic she couldn't place. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving, and listened. Silence. For the first time since she had left the cabin, she couldn't hear the creature. No footsteps crunching in the snow, no distorted voice calling her name. Just the muffled sound of the storm outside. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, her trembling hands gripping the cast-iron skillet she had brought with her. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The shed was small, barely more than a single room. Moonlight filtered through a crack in the wall, illuminating a cluttered workbench covered in tools. A rusted axe leaned against the far corner, and shelves lined with jars and cans suggested someone had used this place as a supply station. Emily's eyes fell on the axe. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than a skillet. She crossed the room on shaky legs and grabbed it, her fingers wrapping around the cold, splintered handle. The moment her hand touched the axe, the lantern outside went out. Emily froze. Her breath caught in her throat as darkness enveloped the shed, leaving her with only the faint slivers of moonlight. And then she heard it. Knock. The sound was soft, almost gentle, but it made her blood run cold. Knock. It was at the door. Emily tightened her grip on the axe, her knuckles whitening. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The creature had found her. The knock came again, louder this time. Emily, the voice was distorted, barely human, but unmistakably her sister's. Please, let me in. Tears pricked her eyes. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Her sister was gone. Whatever was out there was lying. The door rattled and Emily took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Emily, it's so cold, the voice whispered, dripping with mockery. Why won't you help me? She shook her head violently, her back pressing against the far wall of the shed. You're not her, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're not real. The thing outside laughed, a guttural choking sound that sent a shiver down her spine. The door creaked as it strained against the force outside. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Emily didn't dare move. She stared at the door, waiting for the inevitable, her axe raised and ready. Minutes passed. The storm outside raged on, but the creature didn't return. She let out a shaky breath, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. Maybe it was gone. Maybe she was safe, at least for now. But as she turned to set the axe down, she froze. The workbench wasn't empty anymore. Sitting in the center of the cluttered table was a small, snow-dusted box, tied with a frayed red ribbon. It hadn't been there before. Her throat tightened as she stared at it, her mind racing. Had it been left here by someone else? Had the creature? No. She didn't want to think about it. Against her better judgment, she approached the box, her steps slow and deliberate. The air in the shed felt heavier, colder, as if the storm outside had seeped inside. The ribbon was damp, the edges fraying as if it had been tied and untied 1,000 times. Emily's fingers trembled as she reached for it, the urge to know what was inside outweighing her fear. She pulled the ribbon loose and lifted the lid. Inside was a single photograph, old and weathered. She picked it up with shaking hands, her breath hitching as she recognized the faces staring back at her. It was her and her sister. But this wasn't a photo she remembered. In it, they were standing in front of her cabin, their smiles bright and carefree. Except, the cabin in the background wasn't her cabin. It was the shed. And behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was the creature. Emily dropped the photo, her chest tightening as a low, guttural sound filled the room. She wasn't alone. Emily didn't turn around. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to throw open the door and take her chances in the storm. But her feet wouldn't move, rooted to the floor as if the photograph had cursed her. The guttural sound behind her grew louder, like a deep, wet exhale that vibrated through her chest. Slowly, with her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the storm, Emily shifted her gaze to the reflection in the cracked window. Was there? The creature loomed behind her, its distorted frame barely fitting inside the small shed. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, burning with a malevolent hunger that made her stomach twist. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, the sharp angles of its joints bending in ways that defied logic. But it wasn't the sight of the creature that made Emily's blood turn to ice. It was what it held. Dangling from its clawed fingers was her sister's red scarf. The same scarf her sister had worn the night she disappeared. The creature tilted its head, its movements jerky and inhuman. You've been looking for her, haven't you? It rasped, its voice an uncanny imitation of her sister's. She's been waiting for you, Emily. Emily's grip on the axe tightened, her palms slick with sweat. Her instincts screamed at her to fight, to swing with every ounce of strength she had left, but fear paralyzed her. What are you? She managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. The creature's mouth stretched into something resembling a smile, its jagged teeth glinting in the faint light. I am the answer to your prayers, it said mockingly. The reunion you've been dreaming of. It took a step closer, the floorboards groaning under its weight. Emily stumbled back, her back pressing against the wall. Stay away, she hissed, raising the axe. Oh? The creature's laughter cut her off, a grotesque, choking sound that made her skin crawl. You'll what, Emily? You think that little toy will save you? Before she could react, it lunged. Emily screamed, swinging the axe with all her might. The blade struck the creature's arm, sinking into the twisted flesh. But instead of recoiling in pain, it only laughed harder, the sound echoing in her ears like nails on a chalkboard. The axe came loose as the creature yanked its arm back, and Emily stumbled to the side. The door was only a few steps away, but the creature blocked her path, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. "Your sister didn't fight this much," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "She let me in." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her sister, had she faced this same terror? Had she stood where Emily was now, desperate and hopeless? No, Emily wouldn't end like this. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, she feinted to the right before diving to the left, slipping past the creature and toward the door. Her fingers fumbled with the latch as the creature roared behind her, its long limbs swiping through the air. The door burst open, and Emily threw herself into the storm. The icy wind hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop. She ran blindly through the snow, her lungs burning and her vision blurred by tears and snowflakes. The storm seemed angrier now, the wind screaming in her ears as if the forest itself was alive, conspiring against her. Branches clawed at her face and arms as she stumbled through the trees, her boots sinking into the deep snow. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it, feel the creature's presence, its eyes boring into her back. Ahead, the faint outline of a larger structure began to emerge from the storm. At first, she thought it was another hallucination, her mind playing tricks on her. But as she drew closer, the outline sharpened into the shape of a church. The building was old, its stone walls weathered and cracked, but its doors stood tall and imposing. A faint light glowed from the stained glass windows, casting eerie patterns onto the snow. Emily didn't question it. She sprinted toward the church, her legs threatening to give out with every step. The heavy wooden doors groaned as she pushed them open, and she practically fell inside, slamming the doors shut behind her. The silence inside the church was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm outside. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and wax. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering as if disturbed by an unseen breath. Emily collapsed onto one of the pews, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt a sliver of safety. But the feeling didn't last. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something strange. The church was empty, too empty. There were no hymnals, no crosses, no signs of life. And then she saw them. Scattered across the floor were scraps of red fabric, torn and frayed. Emily's stomach turned as she recognized the pieces of her sister's scarf. A chill ran down her spine as the candles flickered again, their flames bending toward the center of the room. The air grew colder and a low, guttural hum began to fill the space. Emily stood, her legs trembling, and turned to face the altar. Something was there. It stood in the shadows, its form indistinct but massive. Its presence filled the room, pressing down on her like a physical weight. "You think you've escaped?" The creature's voice echoed, but it was different now, deeper, more ancient. Emily gripped the pew for support, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The creature stepped into the candlelight, revealing its twisted, horrifying form. It was no longer pretending to be human. Its flesh was blackened and cracked as if burned, and its eyes glowed like molten lava. "I want what was promised," it said, its voice reverberating through the empty church. "Your family owed me a debt, Emily, and I've come to collect." Emily's mind raced. A debt? What was it talking about? She had never heard of anything like this, had never been told of any deal or bargain. "I don't know what you're talking about," she screamed, backing away. The creature laughed, a sound that made her ears ring. "Of course you don't. But ignorance doesn't absolve you." It lunged forward and Emily ran. She didn't know where she was going, there was nowhere to go. But she couldn't stay there, not with that thing. The doors wouldn't budge. The windows were too high. The walls seemed to close in on her as the creature's laughter echoed around her. And then she saw it. Behind the altar, partially hidden by shadows, was a trapdoor. Emily didn't think. She sprinted for it, throwing herself onto the floor and yanking it open. The darkness below was impenetrable, but she didn't care. She climbed down, pulling the door shut behind her. The last thing she heard before the trapdoor closed was the creature's voice, low and mocking. "You can't run forever, Emily. I'll always find you. The air in the crawlspace was suffocating, thick with damp earth and the scent of decay. Emily's hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the trapdoor, her chest heaving as she tried to stifle her panicked breaths. The faint sound of the creature's laughter echoed above her, chilling her to the core. She fumbled for her phone, desperate for even a sliver of light. The screen flickered to life, casting an eerie glow across the narrow space. The dirt walls seemed to close in on her, and the low ceiling brushed against her head as she crouched. She wanted to scream, to cry, to wake up from this nightmare. But she couldn't. Not yet. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, and she froze. Slowly, she turned her phone's light toward the object. It was a chain. No, not just the chain shackles. They were bolted to the dirt floor, their iron links rusted and ancient. The sight of them sent a jolt of fear through her, but it was what lay next to them that made her stomach churn. Bones. Human bones, half buried in the dirt, their brittle edges gnawed and splintered. Emily stumbled back, her foot hitting something hard. She spun around, her phone's light illuminating another set of chains, and another, each accompanied by more bones. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a crawl space, it was a prison. Her breath came faster now, panic clawing at her throat. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here, not with the weight of so much death pressing down on her. But where could she go? The trapdoor above her was the only way back, and she knew what waited on the other side. Her phone's light caught the faint outline of a tunnel, just wide enough for her to crawl through. It was her only option. She hesitated, the thought of crawling into the unknown making her chest tighten. But the distant sound of movement above her forced her hand. The creature was still there, still searching. Without another thought, she dropped to her hands and knees and began to crawl. The tunnel was narrower than she expected, and the dirt was cold and damp against her skin. Her phone's light barely penetrated the darkness ahead, but she pressed on, each movement sending a fresh wave of dirt cascading around her. The sound of her own breathing filled her ears, loud and ragged. She tried to focus on the tunnel ahead, but her mind kept drifting back to the chains, the bones, the whispers of pain that seemed to linger in the air. And then she heard it. A faint scraping sound like nails on stone. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from behind her. Slowly, she turned her head, her phone's light trembling as she aimed it back down the tunnel. Nothing. The tunnel was empty, the way she had come seemingly undisturbed. But the scraping sound didn't stop. It was closer now, louder, as if whatever was making it was just beyond the reach of her light. Panic surged through her, and she scrambled forward, her movements frantic and clumsy. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in tighter with every inch she crawled. She didn't dare look back again. She couldn't. The scraping grew louder, almost deafening now, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down her spine. Her phone flickered, the light dimming for a moment before coming back. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Not now. Please, not now." She crawled faster, her knees and palms scraping against the rough ground. Her lungs burned, and tears blurred her vision, but she couldn't stop. And then, just as her phone's light flickered again, she saw it, a faint glow ahead. Hope surged through her, and she pushed herself harder, her fingers clawing at the dirt as she raced toward the light. The tunnel widened slightly as she reached the source of the glow, revealing a small chamber carved into the earth. The walls were lined with faintly glowing symbols, their shapes unfamiliar and unsettling. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, and atop it sat an old leather-bound book. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the scraping sound was still behind her, louder than ever. She had no choice. She stepped into the chamber, the air thick and oppressive. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and writhe as she moved, their glow pulsating like a heartbeat. The book called to her, its presence almost magnetic. With trembling hands, she reached for it. The leather was cold and rough under her fingers, and the moment she touched it, the symbols on the walls flared brightly. A low, guttural voice filled the chamber, speaking words she couldn't understand. The book grew warm in her hands, and she felt a strange pull, as if it was trying to draw her in. She opened it. The pages were filled with strange markings, symbols that hurt her eyes to look at. But as she flipped through, she found a single word written in English, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Run." The chamber trembled, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter and brighter. The scraping sound was at the entrance now, accompanied by a shadow that loomed impossibly large. Emily didn't need to be told twice. Clutching the book to her chest, she turned and dove into another tunnel that branched off from the chamber. The air grew colder, the walls tighter, but she didn't stop. The growls behind her grew louder, echoing through the narrow space. She could feel the creature's presence, its malice pressing against her like a physical force. But ahead she saw it, a faint glimmer of light brighter than before. She crawled faster, her muscles screaming in protest. The tunnel widened again and she burst out into the open air, collapsing onto the snow. The storm had calmed slightly, the wind no longer howling as fiercely. She gasped for breath, her hands clutching at the book as if it was her lifeline. Behind her, the tunnel entrance remained dark and still. The creature hadn't followed her, yet. But as she looked down at the book, its strange symbols glowing faintly, she realized her nightmare was far from over. Emily sat in the snow, gasping for air, her trembling fingers still clutching the strange book. The storm around her had softened to an eerie stillness, but the world felt no less dangerous. She could feel the weight of the book in her lap, as though it were something alive, pulsing faintly with an unseen energy. She stared at the glowing symbols on the cover. Their faint light twisted and flickered like fireflies trapped under glass, casting strange patterns onto the snow. Her instinct screamed at her to throw it away, to leave it behind and run as far as she could. But something deeper kept her frozen in place. She opened the book again. The strange markings swirled and shifted as if they were alive, and she could barely look at them without her head pounding. She flipped through the pages quickly, desperate for something, anything, that made sense. And then she found it. A page that didn't rhyme. The symbols were still alien, still incomprehensible, but they were stationary now, etched in what looked like dried blood. Beneath them was another word, this time in clear, sharp English. Sacrifice. Emily's breath hitched. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the book. Her mind raced with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Sacrifice? What did it mean? Before she could think further, the book's pages began to flip on their own, faster and faster until they stopped abruptly. Another word appeared at the center of the page. Choose. A sudden coldness enveloped her, sharper than the snow beneath her. The wind picked up again, howling around her in a way that felt unnatural, purposeful. The darkness pressed in, and for a moment, Emily felt as though the forest itself were watching her, waiting for her response. "I don't understand," she shouted, her voice cracking. "Choose what?" The book didn't answer, but the forest did. A guttural growl rumbled through the air, deep and resonant. Emily's head snapped up, her pulse pounding in her ears. She scanned the tree-line, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but she saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time. She scrambled to her feet, the book clutched tightly to her chest. She didn't know where to go, there was nowhere to go, but she couldn't just stand there. The snow crunched loudly beneath her boots as she stumbled forward, her breath clouding the air. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the towering trees closing in on her like prison bars. And then she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first, she thought it was the creature from before, but as she drew closer, she realized it was something, or someone, else. The figure was tall and shrouded in a tattered cloak, its face obscured by shadow. "Who are you?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Emily hesitated, her grip on the book tightening. Every instinct told her to run, but something about the figure held her in place. It was as if the very air around it commanded her attention. Finally, the figure raised an arm, pointing to the book in her hands. "You carry the mark," it said, its voice low and gravelly. "You cannot escape it now." "What does that mean?" Emily demanded, her fear giving way to frustration. "What's happening to me?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her question. "The debt must be paid," it said simply. "What debt?" she shouted. "I don't know what you're talking about. I never made any deal." The figure took a step closer, and Emily instinctively stepped back. "Not you," it said. "Your bloodline. The sins of the past follow you, child. And now they seek their payment." Emily's mind raced. Her bloodline? Sins of the past? None of this made any sense. Her family had always been ordinary, at least as far as she knew. "I didn't agree to this," she said, her voice breaking. The figure's shadowed face seemed to regard her with pity. "It doesn't matter," it said. "The bargain was made. And the price is steep." Before she could respond, a deafening roar split the air, shaking the ground beneath her feet. Emily spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The creature was back. It emerged from the treeline, its massive form illuminated by the faint glow of the book symbols. Its hollow eyes burned with a malevolent light, and its twisted limbs moved with a horrifying grace. Emily turned back to the figure, panic surging through her. "Help me," she pleaded. The figure didn't move. "The book holds the answers you seek," it said. "But every choice has a consequence." And with that, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving her alone with the approaching monster. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she clutched the book tightly. The creature's growl reverberated through the clearing, shaking her to her core. She didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let it end here. Her fingers trembled as she opened the book again, the glowing symbols blurring together. She flipped through the pages desperately, searching for anything that could save her. And then she found it, a single sentence written in blood-red ink. "To banish the shadow, the light must be extinguished." Emily didn't understand. The light? What light? The creature lunged. She stumbled back, her foot catching on a root, and she fell hard onto the snow. The book slipped from her grasp, landing open on the ground beside her. The creature loomed over her, its jagged teeth glinting in the faint light. In that moment, Emily made a decision. Her hand darted toward the book, her fingers curling around its spine. She didn't know what would happen, but she had no other choice. As the creature lunged, she shouted the words aloud, her voice cracking with fear. "To banish the shadow, the light must be extinguished." The symbols on the book flared brilliantly, their light piercing the darkness. The creature let out a bone-chilling roar, its form writhing as if in agony. And then everything went dark. Emily felt herself falling, the world spinning around her. The cold disappeared, replaced by an all-encompassing void. She couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't feel anything but the weight of the book in her hands. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. She opened her eyes. She was no longer in the forest. Emily's eyes darted around her new surroundings, heart hammering in her chest. The snow, the forest, even the freezing wind had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming silence. She stood in what looked like an endless void, neither light nor dark, as if the space around her was both everything and nothing at once. The only thing she could see clearly was the book, still clutched tightly in her hands. Its glow had dimmed, the symbols now pulsating faintly as if they too were exhausted. "Hello?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. The sound echoed strangely, bouncing off invisible walls before fading into the oppressive stillness. She felt a surge of panic. What was this place? Had she escaped the creature, or had she been pulled into something worse? Before she could think further, the air around her began to shift. Shapes materialized out of the void, hazy and indistinct at first but growing sharper with each passing second. She blinked in disbelief as the world around her came into focus. It was her living room. The soft hum of the television filled the air, and the warm glow of a nearby lamp cast familiar shadows on the walls. Everything was exactly as she remembered it, down to the coffee mug sitting on the table and the pile of blankets on the couch. It was impossible. Emily took a hesitant step forward, her boots sinking into the carpet. It felt real, but she knew better than to trust her senses. Nothing about this was right. As she moved deeper into the room, a soft sound caught her attention, a faint whisper barely audible. She froze, straining to hear it. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It wasn't a single voice, but many, overlapping in a chaotic murmur. "Emily?" She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The whispers didn't answer. Instead, they seemed to shift, surrounding her, pressing against her ears like a rising tide. And then she saw it. A figure standing in the hallway. It was small and shadowy, barely more than an outline against the dim light. But there was something unnervingly familiar about its shape, about the way it tilted its head as it stared at her. "Emily," it said, its voice low and distorted. Her blood ran cold. "How do you know my name?" she whispered. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. As it entered the light, Emily's stomach dropped. It was her. Or rather, it looked like her, a perfect reflection of her own face, her own body. But its eyes were wrong, dark and hollow, like twin voids that seemed to pull at her very soul. What is this? Emily stammered, backing away. The doppelganger smiled, a chilling, twisted expression that didn't reach its lifeless eyes. You shouldn't have opened the book, it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. Emily's heart pounded as the room around her began to shift again. The walls seemed to ripple, the furniture warping and twisting into grotesque shapes. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. The doppelganger stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. You can't escape, it said. Not anymore. Emily turned and ran. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the walls narrowing and darkening as she sprinted forward. She clutched the book tightly, its weight growing heavier with every step. Behind her, the doppelganger's footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, as though it knew she couldn't outrun it. Come back, Emily, it called, its voice shifting and distorting. You belong here. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, her feet pounding against the ground. She didn't know where she was going, there was no end in sight, but she couldn't stop. And then she saw it, a door at the end of the hallway, its outline glowing faintly against the darkness. She sprinted toward it, her hand reaching out desperately. As her fingers touched the doorknob, a cold hand grabbed her shoulder, yanking her back. She screamed, whipping around to face her pursuer. But it wasn't the doppelganger. It was something else. The figure was tall and skeletal, its face hidden beneath a hood. Its bony fingers dug into her shoulder, and its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through her. You cannot run from the truth, it said, its voice a low, rumbling growl. What truth? Emily cried, struggling against its grip. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it reached for the book, its fingers curling around the edges. No, Emily shouted, pulling it back. You can't have it. The creature's grip tightened, its strength overwhelming. Emily felt the book being ripped from her hands, its glow flaring brightly as the creature held it aloft. You are bound to this, it said. But the choice is yours. Face the darkness or let it consume you. Emily's mind raced. She didn't understand what it wanted from her, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let it take the book. Summoning every ounce of courage, she lunged forward, grabbing the book with both hands. The creature roared, its grip faltering as she yanked it free. The moment her fingers touched the book again, the world around her exploded into light. She fell to the ground, gasping for air. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the forest. The snow fell softly around her, the storm gone. The book lay open in her hands, its pages blank now, as if whatever power it held had been used up. But she knew better. This wasn't over. Somewhere in the distance, a low growl echoed through the trees. Emily stood, clutching the book tightly. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The nightmare was far from over. Emily leaned against a tree, struggling to catch her breath. The forest was quiet again, the snow soft underfoot, but the silence felt heavier now, oppressive. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind a whisper of something unseen. The book in her hands radiated a faint warmth, its once glowing symbols now dull, almost dormant, yet still brimming with menace. She couldn't shake the memory of the doppelganger, its twisted smile and hollow eyes. The way it had spoken her name as if it knew her, knew everything about her. And that creature, the skeletal figure with its claw-like grip, it wasn't just a monster. It was something ancient, something that understood the book far better than she did. What are you? She whispered to the book as though it might respond. It didn't, of course, but the forest did. A soft crunch of snow came from behind her, deliberate and measured. Emily froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't dare turn around. Emily, a voice called, familiar yet wrong. Her stomach turned. It was the voice of her mother, but it was off, distorted, as though someone else were trying to mimic it. Emily, come here, the voice continued, coaxing, almost sweet. Emily shook her head, gripping the book tightly. You're not her, she said, her voice trembling. The crunching grew louder, closer. Don't be afraid, sweetheart, the voice said, its tone syrupy and unnatural. You've been gone too long. Come home. Tears stung her eyes. Her mother had been gone for years, lost in a car crash when Emily was only 16. Hearing her voice now, even twisted and wrong, was unbearable. "Leave me alone," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the forest was silent again, and Emily dared to hope that whatever was out there had gone. But then she felt it, a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, the book clutched like a shield, and came face to face with her mother, or what looked like her. The figure was perfect, down to the smallest detail. The soft waves of her mother's hair, the warm brown of her eyes, the faint scar on her cheek from a childhood accident. But the smile was wrong, stretched too wide, and her eyes, they were empty. "Emily," it said, reaching out a hand. She stumbled back, shaking her head. "You're not real," she said, her voice rising. "You're not her." The figure's smile faltered, twisting into something colder, sharper. "You're right," it said, its voice dropping to a guttural snarl. "But I can still take you." It lunged at her. Emily screamed, ducking to the side just in time. The creature, no longer pretending to be her mother, slammed into the tree, its body twisting unnaturally as it turned to face her again. Its form was changing, shifting. The features of her mother melted away, replaced by something monstrous. Its skin turned ashen, its limbs elongating into jagged, spindly appendages. Its hollow eyes burned with an eerie light, and its mouth split open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Emily turned and ran. The forest blurred around her as she sprinted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. But the creature was fast, too fast. She could hear it behind her, its guttural growls growing louder, closer. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and twist, roots rising up to trip her, branches clawing at her clothes. "Give me the book," the creature roared, its voice echoing unnaturally. "No," she screamed, clutching the book tighter. Up ahead, she saw a break in the trees, a faint glimmer of light. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning with effort. As she burst into the clearing, she stumbled to a halt. It wasn't just an open space, it was something else entirely. A massive stone altar stood in the center, covered in strange ancient carvings. Surrounding it were towering pillars of ice, their surfaces shimmering with an otherworldly glow. The air was colder here, biting and sharp, and the snow beneath her feet felt like glass. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, its form flickering like a broken image. It let out a low growl, its hollow eyes fixed on the altar. Emily turned to face it, her chest heaving. "What do you want from me?" she shouted. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it raised one skeletal hand and pointed to the altar. "You know what to do," it said, its voice a rasping hiss. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand." The creature stepped closer, its body trembling with barely contained rage. "The book," it said. "It demands payment. Place it on the altar." She looked down at the book in her hands. The symbols on its cover were glowing faintly again, pulsing in time with her racing heart. "What happens if I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The creature's twisted smile returned. "You'll find out," it said. She hesitated, her mind racing. Could she trust it? Of course not. But what choice did she have? With trembling hands, she stepped toward the altar. The creature watched her intently, its eyes gleaming with anticipation. As she placed the book on the cold stone surface, the symbols flared brightly, illuminating the entire clearing. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air was filled with a deafening hum. The creature let out a triumphant roar, its form growing larger, more solid. Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding. "What's happening?" she shouted. The book's glow intensified, and the carvings on the altar began to shift, forming new shapes and patterns. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the world around her changed. She was no longer in the forest. She stood in a vast, cavernous space, the walls lined with countless shelves filled with books identical to the one she had carried. The air was heavy with an oppressive energy, and a massive figure loomed in the distance. It wasn't the creature from before. This was something far worse. The figure turned toward her, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "Welcome," it said, its voice deep and resonant. "You have brought me what I need." Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The figure stepped closer, its massive form casting a shadow over her. "I am the keeper," it said, "and you, child, are mine." The keeper's voice echoed in the vast cavern, reverberating against the walls and shaking the ground beneath Emily's feet. She tried to push herself to her knees, but it felt as though the air itself was pressing down on her, heavy and unrelenting. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. It was as though her body was frozen in place, caught in the pull of this overwhelming presence. The keeper stepped closer, its form more intimidating the nearer it came. It towered above her, cloaked in shadow, its features indistinct but its power undeniable. Its eyes glowed with an unsettling light, brighter than anything Emily had ever seen, and they fixed on her as if she were nothing more than a pawn in a game it controlled. "You've done well, Emily," the keeper's voice boomed, sending a shiver down her spine. "You brought the book. And now you'll serve its purpose." She tried to speak, but no words came out. Panic bubbled inside her, her heart racing in her chest. What was this place? What did the keeper want from her? What had she gotten herself into? "Why me?" she finally managed to croak. "What do you want?" The keeper's glowing eyes flickered, a ripple of something like amusement flashing across its face. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you must give." Emily's stomach twisted. "I don't understand. I've done nothing, just tried to survive." The keeper's voice became colder, sharper. "Survival was never your true goal. You were chosen. The book, the power within it, it needs to be passed on. You cannot escape what has been set in motion." Emily looked down at the book lying on the cold stone floor. It pulsed softly, almost as if it were alive, waiting. She could feel its presence like a weight pressing on her chest. It was the key to this strange, terrifying place, but she didn't know how. She didn't know what to do with it. "You're lying," Emily whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. It can't be." The keeper's laughter rumbled through the cavern, deep and unsettling. "Your disbelief is irrelevant. This is real, Emily. Everything you've seen, everything you've experienced, it is all part of the cycle. You are part of it." The word sent a wave of confusion through her, and for a moment she was lost in the vastness of this place, the weight of everything crashing down on her. How had it come to this? How had the simple act of opening the book led her here? This cavern, the keeper, everything was beyond her understanding. But one thing was clear, she had no choice. "You have one chance," the keeper said, its voice cutting through the noise in her mind. "One chance to make it right." Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand. She gripped the book, feeling its strange warmth, and stared at the keeper. "What do I have to do?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear churning inside her. The keeper's smile grew wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the darkness. "You must choose, Emily. The power of the book is yours to command, but it will consume you if you fail to master it. Place it on the altar. Let it consume you, or turn away and let it consume everything else." Emily's mind raced. The book had already caused so much pain, so much destruction. She couldn't let it destroy her too. She couldn't be the one to bring even more chaos into the world. But could she turn away? Could she really walk away from the power it offered? The book seemed to call to her, whispering promises of control, of answers, of power. But at what cost? "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "I won't be part of this." The keeper's expression darkened, its eyes narrowing. "Then you will lose everything," it warned, its voice thick with malice. "You cannot defy what is meant to be." Before Emily could respond, the cavern around her began to shift. The walls seemed to twist and stretch, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. The air grew thick, filled with an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. The book pulsed more violently now, its glow intensifying until the entire cavern was bathed in a blinding light. "Your choice has been made," the keeper said. "You will understand soon enough." Suddenly the light exploded outward, and Emily was thrown backward, crashing into the stone floor. She gasped for breath, her body aching, her vision blurry. When she managed to sit up, the keeper was gone. The cavern was silent once again, but something had changed. The book was still in front of her, but now it was silent too, no longer pulsing with that strange energy. It lay dormant as if waiting. Emily reached out, her fingers brushing the cover. The moment she touched it, the entire cavern seemed to breathe with a new life, the air vibrating with energy. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt the book's power surge through her, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. This was it. There was no turning back now. The ground beneath her feet cracked, the stone splitting open as a massive rift began to form. From the darkness within the rift, a figure emerged. Not the keeper. Something much darker. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a hood. But Emily could feel its presence, something ancient and malevolent. It stepped forward, and as it did, the very air seemed to freeze. "Emily," the figure whispered, its voice like the wind howling through the trees. You have no idea what you've unleashed. The rift behind the figure expanded, revealing a vast, dark void. And in that void something stirred. Something hungry. Emily took a step back, clutching the book tightly. The figure's gaze locked onto her, its hollow eyes burning with an unspoken promise. You've chosen your path, it said, its voice sending chills through her bones. Now you will face the consequences. Emily didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to stop this. But one thing was clear. The nightmare was far from over. The figure before Emily loomed like an embodiment of all her worst fears, its presence suffocating, as if the very air around her was turning to stone. Her breath hitched, heart racing, but there was no room for panic now. There was no escape. The rift behind the figure pulsed with an otherworldly energy, the shadows within it writhing like living things eager to break free. You can't stop it, the figure hissed, stepping closer, its voice slithering into her mind. The book has chosen you. You cannot unwrite what's been written. Emily's hands trembled as she gripped the book tighter. She didn't understand. How could she have been so blind? How could she have thought the power of the book was something she could control? You're wrong, she whispered, trying to steady herself. I won't let it win. The figure's laugh was a low, menacing sound that seemed to echo from all around her. You've already lost. For a moment, Emily felt that crushing sense of inevitability, the weight of her choices, her past mistakes, the path that had led her here. But then, something changed. The book. It didn't feel the same anymore. Its energy had been steady, cold, controlling, but now it pulsed differently. Emily could feel it deep within her bones. It was waiting, responding to her. The power was still there, but she realized with a shock of clarity that it wasn't entirely the book that controlled her. It was her choices. It always had been. Her heart thundered as the realization struck her. She had been given a choice all along. A choice to fight, to resist, to break free from the curse that had bound her to this place. Without thinking, Emily stepped forward, clutching the book in both hands. The figure recoiled, sensing the shift in the air, sensing that she had awakened to the truth. But it was too late. The ground trembled violently beneath her, cracks spreading across the stone floor like veins of lightning. Emily thrust the book forward, her voice rising in a defiant shout. Leave me alone. And just like that, the rift behind the figure cracked open, the shadows rushing forward with a deafening roar, swallowing everything in their path. The figure shrieked as it was pulled into the void, its form disintegrating in the darkness. Emily stood frozen, the air still and heavy, but she could feel the weight of the battle lifting from her shoulders. The oppressive presence was gone, replaced by silence. For the first time she was truly alone. She looked down at the book in her hands. It felt different now. Its power was no longer a curse but a tool. A key to understanding, to control, to survival. She wasn't sure how, but she knew that she had found a way to break the cycle. The cavern around her started to dissolve, the walls crumbling into nothingness, the shadows receding. The air warmed, and the ground beneath her feet began to soften. The world was shifting, changing, rebuilding itself from the ashes of the past. And Emily, for the first time, felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She had won. Against all odds, she had defied the darkness. But just as she was beginning to breathe easier, a whisper, soft and distant, drifted into her ears. Is it over? She asked aloud, her voice barely more than a murmur. And in response, the book glowed faintly again. Not yet. End of story. Thank you for staying with me through the journey. There's always a possibility for more, but for now, remember, even in the darkest moments, you have the power to change your fate. The story isn't always over until you decide it is.